Lockhart tapped the blackboard, and a huge tapestry slid down from the ceiling, revealing a world map streaked with colored blocks. As everyone knows, he said, the world today is primarily divided among three great powers: wizards, muggles, and goblins. He leaned on the podium. On the tapestry, different colors clashed, swallowing strips of one another and changing them to their own hue. Each of those powers has many internal distinctions. This year, we will study their differences, alliances, and spheres of influence, one by one. He lifted his short wand and used it like a pointer, indicating the white and black masses that took up most of the map. Undoubtedly, wizards still dominate much of the world. Compared to the few goblins and the technologically limited muggles, wizardry has unique advantages at restoring production and improving survival. But wizards are not united. He tapped the black areas. The black represents the Dark Lord and his Wizengamot. They control most of the prime lands of Europe. He traced their territory with the wand, from northern and eastern Europe through much of France and Germany, sweeping south and even across seas to rich parts of Africa. The cloud-like blocks pulsed, like fiendfire burning through the map. "Are we in the Wizengamot's territory now?" a girl asked uneasily. "Yes, but don't worry, child." Lockhart flashed his practiced smile. "First, Hogwarts' concealment charms are very effective. The castle cannot be found without special means. Second, these days people tend to settle only in habitable areas. Large tracts of desolate wilderness, though marked on the map as belonging to the Wizengamot, are essentially unmanaged. There are many small Muggle strongholds scattered through those wastes, and even the Wizengamot can't spare the effort to clear them all. Their focus is on fighting the more powerful Muggle groups to the east, and the ubiquitous, if troublesome, goblins." He grew more serious. "To wizards, goblins are extremists. When dealing with ordinary wizards, the Wizengamot may be somewhat restrained and might argue, if you persist in listening, they'll probably only drive you away. But when it comes to Muggles and goblins, there are only two options: obedience or death. They use fiendfire to destroy Muggle buildings, wreck their machines, and burn their books. The wise among Muggles are mercilessly killed. Any attempt to preserve technology becomes a priority target. Muggles have one value to the Wizengamot: to serve as slaves, supporting the noble wizard lords. Only when a wizard child is born into a Muggle family does that family get to bask in the child's glory and be considered part of the ruling class. And their cruelty to goblins is worse." He steepled his fingers. "Grindelwald believes it was the goblins' betrayal that enabled the once weak Muggles to gain the power to destroy the world. Muggles should have been ruled by wizards without resistance. Their weapons should have been destroyed at the outset. And the original number and yield of nuclear bombs were not enough to end the world. It was because goblins helped early on that the eternal winter curse shrouded the sky, and an astonishing number of nuclear explosions engulfed the globe. So the Wizengamot kills goblins on sight and destroys every goblin tunnels they can find. The goblins' betrayal also crippled wizards' preparedness. The paralysis of the financial system and the shutdown of institutions like the Ministry of Magic left wizards disorganized during the Muggles' first counterattacks, unable to mount an effective defense. Of course, Professor Quirrell probably covered much of this in his lecture." Lockhart added, almost conversationally, "Professor, what are goblin tunnels?" A boy put up his hand. "I think you all noticed there isn't much dark red on this map," Lockhart replied with a smile. "Goblins are clearly one of the three great powers, yet they don't occupy vast territories. Part of that is their small numbers. Another is that they mostly live in goblin tunnels. That's a kind of magic similar to a portkey, but far stronger. Goblins attach their tunnels to the physical world and open vast secret realms, goblin tunnels. The environment inside is far more hospitable than the outside, better suited to goblin life. But once a goblin tunnels is opened, it is fixed in place and must be anchored to something stable: a mountain, a swamp, a dense forest. So they hide their entrances in secluded places to avoid detection by the Wizengamot. The most famous goblin tunnels was the Gringotts Vault beneath London 50 years ago. Had that cavern actually been dug under London, Muggles would long ago have discovered it. And after the goblins' betrayal, the Gringotts Vault, being immobile, was raided by wizards. The nobles swept away all the galleons inside, which kept the wizarding economy from total collapse. After the world was devastated, wizards and muggles suffered most, and the goblins achieved their aim. Humanity was greatly reduced, and with the resources they took from muggles, goblins gained the ability to build one goblin tunnels after another, hiding across unknown places and living in peace. Only when their lairs were discovered by wizards would sudden war erupt between them. The goblins are too wicked. If they just want to live apart, why annihilate humans? A small boy protested, because humans drove the original goblins from forests, swamps, and mountains. Hermione said calmly from her seat, "History of magic records that humans discovered goblins early and that wizards enslaving goblins came even later. For goblins, humans are the most maddening species. They destroy the foundations of goblin tunnels, use explosives to level mountains, clear forests, drain swamps, and always try to enslave other beings. If eliminating humans, even at the cost of shattering the world, means they can live safely in their tunnels, it may not seem too high a price to them." Miss Granger is absolutely right. Lockhart clapped politely and made a small joke. But that answer will probably earn you extra credit with Professor Quirrell. Today, no one really knows where all the goblins are or how many goblin tunnels they've built, he continued. There have been goblin sightings everywhere. Some scholars believe the goblins may have created an unprecedentedly vast secret realm, linked so that any goblin tunnels can access it. Even if wizards discover and destroy one entrance, they cannot truly destroy such an enormous realm. As he spoke, tiny dark red pinpricks glimmered over the colored lands on the tapestry. It said the Albanian forest once held a goblin tunnels, but Lord Voldemort seized it and sealed that entrance. On the map, a large dark red area shifted to deep green, the color of the Green Flame Party. "I'd like to see what the goblin realm is like," Harry muttered. "Don't even think about it," said a nearby voice. "Goblins would never let wizards in. If anything, they despise wizards more than muggles." "We've strayed from our subject." Lockhart clapped and steered everyone back. "Our main lesson today is the power of wizards." 102. The Path of Glory. The Wizengamot controls most of the prime territories in Europe and Africa. Under the Dark Lord's leadership, they're unbeatable. Muggles and goblins must unite to stop his momentum. Honestly, if Dumbledore and Grindelwald had joined forces, they would have reshaped the world, Lockhart said, eyes distant. It was a pity the two most powerful wizards could not be brought together. But we all know the Order of the Phoenix's stance. Dumbledore cannot tolerate Grindelwald's atrocities, so the wizarding world has effectively split into two camps. He traced a route on the map with his short wand, from Britain westward to North America, a large white area, but the white looked pale and murky, like stagnant water. The White Wizard Camp is loose, hardly a camp. It's just a group of wizards who oppose Grindelwald's ideals and are willing to rally behind Dumbledore as a figurehead. Lockhart's expression turned disdainful. He had little respect for those self-important, power-hungry types. In my view, they only need someone who can stand up to the Dark Lord, someone whose name they can borrow to keep ruling others. Dumbledore needs them to fund Hogwarts and to cultivate fresh blood for the wizarding world. Both sides take what they need. From Britain to North America, these noble wizards don't care about the Order's ideals. They won't stand in the path of the Wizengamot's conquest. They're a bunch of worms muddling along, hoping death comes a day later than pleasure. Many Slytherin children sat below. Their parents were exactly the sort Lockhart described. Faces flushed. They had no ready rebuttal. "Professor, aren't you from Malfoy Manor yourself? And you're still the head of Slytherin." Daphne hissed, reminding him and warning the children that his words in class might be reported back to their families and used against him. Lockhart, however, showed no fear. He didn't need anything from those nobles. They needed him to hold the post of head of Slytherin while they bickered over a compromise candidate. If Hogwarts' 1,000-year tradition were broken and Dumbledore appointed a Gryffindor head of Slytherin, that would suit him just fine, and in his private opinion, Lily Potter would be a fine choice. "Miss Greengrass," he said earnestly to the little girl, "as a Slytherin, I hope you understand where honor should come from, not merely enjoy it as a birthright." He wasn't angry. He hoped to change the children's outlook. That, after all, might alter Malfoy Manor's future behavior, something Dumbledore would applaud. The nobles led by Malfoy Manor did establish refuges in the wasteland, saving many wizards and muggles. Their contributions are immense. He paused, looking down at the young snakes. But children, do you realize everything you've enjoyed from birth wasn't exactly earned? Every one of your homes has a huge number of Muggle servants. They've taken over much of the work that once fell to house elves, which frees house elves for more difficult or dangerous tasks that require magic. Some wizards have even become part of the servant class. The children's faces showed confusion. The idea that their comforts relied on servants they never saw didn't compute easily. If you weren't lucky enough to be born into a noble family, would you be willing to do the menial tasks you despise? Waking other children, washing them, helping with their toilet needs? This, Lockhart suggested, was the norm at Malfoy Manor. Even with convenient magic, the nobles preferred to be served. Even if cleaning spells were quick and cooking charms convenient, they liked Muggle servants to wax the floors by hand and to send out incompetent cooks to feed the mutated beasts, just so they could feel attended to. But if my father hadn't fed them, they would have starved in the wilderness, one child muttered. To him, it seemed fair. Malfoy Manor saved their lives, so selling themselves into servitude repaid that debt. Lockhart inhaled and replied with patience. People ought not be born into slavery. Honor and power need boundaries and just aims, just as Salazar Slytherin envisioned. Though he believed in purebloods, he still gave his castle and knowledge, creating a refuge for future students. He fixed the child with a steady look. Now you enjoy Salazar Slytherin's safe castle and learn deep, secret magics from professors. Without that, you might only study outdated theories at home, as clumsy as a snot-eating puffskein. When you grow up and face groups like the Green Flame Party, you would be utterly defenseless. That kindness is immense. So tell me, would you prefer to become a slave of Hogwarts, serving us like a house elf in the kitchen? The child was speechless. Lockhart's analogy had holes, but a 12-year-old could not untangle them on the spot. How you obtain honor matters more than the honor itself, he emphasized. All right, we've wandered a bit far afield. He forced a smile. Let's return to the White Wizard camp. The Order of the Phoenix, led by Dumbledore, advocates a new norm, a harmonious coexistence of wizards, muggles, and goblins. Professor, even if goblins wanted to exterminate us, do we still have to coexist with them? Ron raised his hand. Not all goblins think that way, Lockhart replied with a calm smile. Goblins are divided too. There are isolationists, coexistence factions, and the extreme extinction faction. We'll go into those in later classes. In fact, Dumbledore's early thinking adhered to the old statute of secrecy. He thought the wizarding world should avoid easy interaction with muggles, better to follow the rules than break them. But with Grindelwald's brazen burning of Paris, the statute of secrecy was effectively shattered, and Dumbledore had to adjust his approach. Since exposure is inevitable, choosing the gentlest way to coexist is best for everyone. Lockhart was not a formal member of the Order. He was an independent, though ideologically closer to Dumbledore than to Grindelwald. To many, Dumbledore's ideals sounded like empty slogans, but Lockhart was himself an idealist. He had traveled the world helping as much as he could, a romantic in his own right. After the class, Hermione had a much clearer grasp of the global situation and the ideologies on both sides. Others might have understood less, but a seed had been planted. The wasteland they'd encounter after leaving school would test today's lessons. I think everyone learned something today, Lockhart said, looking over the room. A few Slytherin boys still seemed resentful, but he didn't care. Finally, I have one more announcement. I think you'll like it. He smiled, and curiosity rippled through the students. I've spoken with Dumbledore. We're setting aside part of future Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons for outdoor practical training. He beamed. At appropriate times, we will travel outside Hogwarts to observe dangerous mutated beast lairs, former battlefields, and even areas where goblin tunnels might be found. These field lessons will count toward your grades and year-end assessments. Having traveled for years, Lockhart knew the kinds of dangers along Hogwarts routes. With proper reconnaissance and risk assessment, These trips wouldn't be needlessly hazardous. They would give students hands-on knowledge. The classroom erupted as if the ceiling had been blown off. The children leapt up, cheering. Their earlier heavy thoughts vanished. In that moment, Lockhart was, to every child present, the greatest defense against the dark arts professor in the world. 103. Second-year daily life after defense against the dark arts. The news raced through the castle like wildfire. The second years were first to hear. The upper years would have their turn in a day or two, and the first years, still had to spend more time learning tactical rolling. Field practice was simply too advanced for them. Professor McGonagall had originally opposed letting the second years go, but this year there was Hermione. The thought of Hermione coming to her with tearful eyes if she were forbidden to join softened her resolve. This child's combat aptitude exceeded that of many teachers. An early glimpse of the wilderness could only be beneficial, couldn't it? In the end, McGonagall relented. She only barred the first years. After all, those little ones hadn't even learned a proper levitation charm yet. Were they expected to catch mice out in the wild? Except for the first years, who mourned as if a great tragedy had struck, the rest of the school buzzed with speculation about the field practice destination. Hogwarts was still on the Italian peninsula, but the planned route would continue west toward Spain. Provence. I bet we'll go to Provence. My mum said the Verdun caves hide a monster called the Lord of the Abyss, breathes fire and roars at the great wind pass. Will we run into a picaro? My dad's aunt says it's a giant bird in Spain with huge wings and sharp claws that steals people's souls and eats them. Those are all old stories. I think we'll run into the Wizengamot, maybe even pass right through their front lines with Muggles. The conjecture grew wilder by the minute, but the field practice was still some days away. Hermione wasn't caught up in the speculation. She had too much to do. Days were a blur of lessons, homework, reading the year's textbooks early, and the Weasley twins' books besides, and poring over expanded magical tomes in the library. On top of all that, she was still consolidating and adapting the Forbidden Land magic she had brought with her. Most of the Shining Stone magic she could cast normally now, but other factions, Death, Flame, Sin, had elements that relied on faith. To use them here, she had to strip those faith-bound aspects away and reconstruct the spells as pure magic. Incendio could produce fire, but spells like Magma Shot, Golem's Great Arrow, or the more advanced Rancor Call were far more destructive than simple flame. There was no dead Reichard in this world to allow her to cast Rancor Call, but other magma magics contained the Volcano Manor's secret incantations, terrifying power known as blasphemy. Those concepts existed in Hermione's mind, but translating them into this world's framework was hard. The prayer-based magics, Giant's Flame, Dragon Communion, Beast, Golden Tree, Frenzied Flame, needed a level of faith she didn't possess here. She hadn't yet found a safe, faithful free way to reproduce them. Outside of Shining Stone magic, gravity and cold were the easiest for her to work with. They required no faith. She used death magic fairly often, mostly limited to lighting ghost flame. The deeper rites, summoning spirits and deity-bound rituals, were out of reach without faith. Rituals to call a specific departed soul, however, she could still manage. Hermione's powerful soul granted her heightened senses. She'd activated Sky Eye and had a natural affinity for the oracle-type magics. The oracle bubbles, floating, beautiful spheres used for divination by the claimant of the Forbidden Land, weren't particularly combat-ready. In this world, without a connection to any god, the bubbles contained no true prophecies, only unstable magic that exploded on contact. Their slow drift made them almost useless in a fight, though perhaps they could serve auxiliary work for Sky Eye's divinations later. In Charms, Professor Flitwick encouraged Hermione to publish more on Shining Stone magic. He believed she'd made a promising start last year, and after months of fermenting attention outside the school, the field was beginning to gain recognition. But entry-level spells alone wouldn't excite the wider wizarding community into research. Flitwick wanted her to pick 2 suitable spells from her repertoire and publish them, both to advance the field and to steer its development safely. Hermione worried. High-end Shining Stone research often risked crossing into forbidden territory. Professor Sellen's disregard for human life and his transformation into a stone of Garank and the troubling forms reached by some primeval current sorcerers were warnings. Still, Flitwick's suggestion was sensible. Without careful guidance, mixing shining stone magic with this world's ambient energies could be misinterpreted and become dangerous. She needed two spells that were both safe and substantially more sophisticated than basic shining stone pebbles. She chose Cragshard and Skyfall magic. Cragshard was mined from the Shining Stone miner's tradition, outdated by Orthodox Academy standards, but superb for breaking and shaping rock. Its practical, non-ambitious nature made it less likely to stray into the forbidden, and mining and cave expansion were useful for settlement development. Practical applications that would appeal to wizards here. Skyfall magic, a crystalline art sometimes called glintstone shard by sorcerers, focused on the properties of the crystallians themselves rather than cosmic theory. The crystallian faction's approach felt safer to Hermione, and because the crystallian species didn't exist in this world, she could guide any theoretical breakthroughs slowly and deliberately, minimizing the chance of dangerous crossovers. Cragshard and Skyfall would therefore be the subjects of two separate papers. With that decided, she carved time out of her scarce hours to outline the papers. Flitwick wasn't hasty. One valuable paper a year from a student was already exceptional. Hermione aimed for two. In potions, she and Professor Lily discussed invigorating perfume and iron pot potion. Finding appropriate ingredients would be tricky, and Lily, intrigued rather than dismissive, promised to think about possible substitutions from the school's stores. For now, Hermione shelved the perfumery research and put the freed time into training Harry and his friends. Their nighttime sessions took up most of her remaining energy. In the room of requirement, she taught Harry a shining stone offensive technique he'd already taken to, magic weapon, and helped Neville learn the basics. Neville enjoyed hitting hard in close combat and kept improving rapidly. Hermione taught Ron a magic shield. The redhead's control improved dramatically once he had a proper wand. He picked up the casting method quickly, and what remained was practice and learning to use it in real fights. The one headache was the first-year Colin. He shadowed Hermione everywhere, echoing her every word loudly and refusing to let anyone disagree. He'd fling paints and force his stick figure portraits of Hermione on anyone who would look. Hermione had to avoid him constantly until she finally fled to the Shining Stone Hall on the 4th floor, usually off-limits to other students. There, to her surprise, she found Hagrid had returned after a long absence and had brought with him some unexpected delights. 104. Ghost Owl. Even under a shrinking charm, Hagrid was still an imposing presence. If he stood at full height, including the length of Aragog, he would have been nearly 4 meters tall, enough to fill the whole 4th-floor antechamber. That was one of the reasons he'd been chosen to guard the Philosopher's Stone. In such a cramped space, if Lucius hadn't pre-recorded the basilisk's cries as a distraction, nobody could have dodged one of Hagrid's swings. Even layers of turtle shell armor would have been useless. The antechamber had been converted into Hagrid's living space, and for the moment, into a small, swamp-like habitat. Rotten planks, clumps of foul soil, and blackened puddles had been arranged into a nest area. A small, magical moon hung from the ceiling like a dull, steady light bulb, giving everything a pale, continuous glow. Hagrid had his back to Hermione, busy with something on a bed of damp leaves. Up close, she could see what it was, a clutch of glowing, green-tinged eggs. "What kind of creatures' eggs are these?" Hermione asked. "Oh, you scared me, girl." Hagrid nearly jumped and banged his head on the low roof. Fang might have warned him, but the great boarhound was parked on his bed, covering his nose with his paws and refusing to be bothered by the stink. Hagrid patted his enormous chest, wiped his muddy hands on his coat, and cheerfully reached for a plate on the table. On it lay a small, greasy morsel, apparently a rune spore, which he offered to Hermione. She looked at Hagrid's filthy hands and at the rune spore smeared with some unidentifiable reek, hesitated, and for the first time in memory, turned down something Hagrid offered. "Thanks, I'm not hungry. Long time no see, Hagrid. How was your holiday? Where did you get these eggs? Do they have to live in?" She waved her hand toward the swamp and hesitated at the smell, which finally reached her at close range. Hagrid shrugged. Professor Sprout and the other staff can't stand this sort of stink neither, so we've had to contain it with charms so it don't spread. You only smell it when you come near." He grinned, and with a proud little sniff, explained, "These are treasures Mr. Scamander himself went to fetch. The wizarding world's communications restoration depends on them." "Ghost owls," he said reverently, running a mud-stained finger along one of the eggs. "A kind of bird what can live in extreme environments and tolerate radiation, and they can pass through most magical barriers. Not so hard to tame, neither." Hermione peered closer. The eggs pulsed faintly green. Aragog, lying under a pile of straw, seemed to be drooling. "Newt found him near Auschwitz," Hagrid went on. "Professor Kettleburn and me spent the whole summer rootin' around that stinkin' place." Kettleburn, the old care of magical creatures professor Hermione had heard of but never met, was a man famed for catching creatures all over the world. He was also much patched and replaced with prosthetic limbs after decades of accidents. Hagrid's voice grew somber as he explained what had driven the search. Since the world changed, a lot of the old magical owls couldn't cope. Goblin curses, radioactive dust, most of them died off. Communication got hit hard, post and papers suffering terribly. Hogwarts had to stop sending admission letters by owl, so now the professors carry 'em in person. He set his muddy plate back down and listened for the skittering of acromantula hatchlings below. They pushed open the trapdoor with bundles of damp twigs and other recyclables they'd collected outside, piling them into the nest. These birds, Newt calls them ghost owls, they grow up in about 10 months. When they're ready, their bodies change to something between solid and spirit. They can slip through walls and most barriers, and cold weapons can't harm them. But they're fragile to fierce heat. Too much fire'll flatten them proper. Hermione reached out, and seeing Hagrid make no move to stop her, she touched an egg. It was cool and oddly soft, with a springy give where a normal egg would be hard. For half a moment, she thought of the golden bird's talons in the Forbidden Land and wondered, half absurdly, if these smelly birds might be edible. "Professor Sprout's been reworking the old owlery in the West Tower," Hagrid continued. "It was abandoned too many years, not right for him as it is. Ghost owls like damp, rotten places, dead tree trunks, things like that. If it don't smell bad enough, they won't breed. So Sprout's got her work cut out for her. Me? I'm looking after these here eggs till then." When Hagrid talked about creatures, his whole face lit up. He told Hermione what little the two of them and Newt suspected. The ghost owls might be tied to Muggle souls. The mass deaths of the war and the lingering radiation around sites like Auschwitz had driven nearby magical owls to mutate. Cut off from their ordinary prey, they'd probably fed on corpses, the lot of them. An awful diet that might have shifted their intelligence towards something more cunning, more human. Hagrid scratched his head. "Don't know why they love the stink so much. They even defecate in their own nests." He sounded baffled as he asked, "Where are the parents?" Peering through the translucent shell of one egg, Hermione could make out tiny curled shapes, embryos as small as chicks, snug inside the green glow. "The adults are being taken by Master Scamander and Professor Kettleburn to be tamed," Hagrid said. "Maybe in a few months, you'll be able to order the Daily Prophet in the Great Hall again." Hermione wasn't especially excited about the Prophet, but the idea of ordering supplies from Malfoy Manor arriving at Hogwarts was useful for her perfumery research. "Could we raise one ourselves?" she asked. Having a personal owl would be far more convenient than relying on whatever the school provided. Hagrid laughed. Before the war, bringing an owl to school was usual. Letters even told you which pets you could bring: owls, cats, toads. His smile faded. After the war, folks couldn't afford textbooks nor robes. Fewer and fewer brought pets. He looked thoughtful for a moment, then brightened. "When's your birthday, Hermione? If one of these hatches, then, I might give you one for a present, on the condition you raise it yourself. Mind you, it'll make your dormitory smell something fierce." The question stopped Hermione short, not because she minded the idea of Hagrid giving her such a rare creature, but because, for an instant, she couldn't remember her own birthday. So much of the old civilized life had been wiped away. In the settlement where she'd grown up, only a few elders kept calendars and knew how to reckon dates. They alone knew when to sow and when to dig, and the rest were taught by them. In the East, she'd heard, records survived longer. Grindelwald's wars had been worse for the wild Muggle settlements under wizard rule. Last summer had been a blur, and Harry's birthday parties had been mostly Potter family affairs. Her own birthday the year before had been overlooked amid the chaos. "It's in September," she said slowly. She remembered a tattered, much-thumbed handmade calendar she'd seen once, the charcoal numbers crooked in their boxes, and one date ringed. September 19th, she finished. Hermione felt a small, disbelieving thrill. She was almost 13. Hermione didn't put much stock in birthdays. In the Forbidden Land, no one made a point of remembering the day they were born. Without death, new births felt less significant. During the long reign of the Golden Dynasty, fated death had been sealed, and the blessed Golden family lived so long their lives seemed endless. The only way out was to voluntarily return to the World Tree, and that was hardly the peaceful rest the fated son represented as true death. Once you climbed to the rank of a god, natural death became virtually impossible. Demigods paid no mind to a single day on the calendar, and the rest of the Forbidden Land followed their lead. There simply was no birthday culture. Hermione was also, frankly, a little put off by the idea of ghost owlets. The adult birds were beautiful, translucent, glowing little owls, but the thought of having to deal with a litter box by her bed made the whole proposition unappealing. Training them to carry letters would take at least another year. The prospect of having to live with indoor droppings until then made her reluctant. She'd rather wait for Newt and the others to train them properly, to teach the birds not to relieve themselves indoors before even considering one. Then she had a thought. She'd nearly forgotten the small, quick little ghost that flitted around her. It wasn't much for long-distance errands like trips to Malfoy Manor, but for messages across the castle, it would be perfect. It could dart from one end of the building to the other in less time than it took to drink a cup of water, functioning much like the professor's Patronuses. Hermione had already tried the Patronus charm in her self-study of higher-level material, but without sufficient happy memories, she'd only managed a puff of white mist, far from a fully corporeal Patronus. Still, a tiny ghost messenger would be faster than running. 2 days passed, and the students finally had their new week's reversal of anti-wizard techniques class, the first practical combat lesson of the year. According to Professor Lockhart's arrangements, the following Defense Against the Dark Arts session would be an outdoor practical. Everyone was excited. They wanted to impress, to show they weren't too weak to be trusted with outdoor exercises. So they assembled on the lawn outside the castle with energy to spare. As in first year, the students were grouped by year, 7 groups in all, with professors keeping order. Professor Lockhart and Professor Flitwick would teach the class. The difference from last year was that, without Lucius causing trouble, the new Slytherin dean was much more professional. Lockhart, still dressed as a ranger wizard, looked far less nervous than the first time he'd introduced himself. He climbed the stage, clapped his hands, and amplified his voice with a sonorous charm. "All right, children," he called. "Professor Flitwick has filled me in on your progress. To be honest, you're far stronger than I was at your age." He grinned. "In first year, I even wet my pants because of a snake my opponent conjured." The students laughed. The image of the daring, globe-trotting ranger wizard peeing his robes was absurd. No one truly believed it, but it set a light tone. "This year, I'll teach you from my years of adventure and practical experience," Lockhart continued. "You won't just practice against classmates, you'll face real dangers in the wild to ensure you master these techniques. Of course, I'll tailor the exercises to each year," he added. "Second years won't be forced to face dragons. Well, Miss Granger might be an exception. She can slice dragons." He raised an eyebrow in Hermione's direction. The mention of Hermione set off another round of laughter. Her combat prowess had become common knowledge, a running joke around the school. Students compared her to certain professors and speculated who would survive a duel with her. Lockhart looked pleased with the relaxed, cheerful atmosphere and, after exchanging a glance with Flitwick, decided to go through with a demonstration match. "Before we begin," he said, "Professor Flitwick and I will give you a duel demonstration. It'll show you what a contest between 2 top wizards looks like." That announcement got the students buzzing again. Flitwick's cool composure during his confrontation with Bellatrix last year, his performance that forced a notorious dark witch into retreat, had shown he was a duelist to be reckoned with. Though Lockhart was younger, his books on defense against the dark arts and his recent fame made many think he could be the next dueling champion. The outcome between the two was anyone's guess. "I'm backing Phileas," Professor McGonagall said from the sidelines, with Lily and Professor Sprout nearby. Older wizards often have more depth of magic. Phileas has spent decades in charms. He probably knows spells Gilderoy hasn't even heard of. "I think Lockhart has a good chance," Miss Potter piped up excitedly. "Dueling is as much about reaction speed as power. Sometimes you know what to do, but your body won't keep up." "Don't go insulting us old professors." Sprout feigned offense. "For that remark alone, I support Phileas." As the professors chatted, the students fell back into a wide circle to make room for Lockhart and Flitwick in the center of the field. A voice then shouted, sharp and eager, "We want to see a duel between the professor and Hermione." The shout froze everyone for a moment before curiosity took over. The idea was strangely entertaining. "Yeah, can Hermione really beat a professor? This is a chance to find out." "After what Lucius went through last year and how Hermione captured him, I'd love to see Lockhart try." "Let Hermione spar with the professor. Leave us second years alone. We don't want to be her opponent." Hermione shot Fred and George a glare that held a lethal amount of annoyance. Of course it had been them, one of their voice change pranks. Lockhart paused, then looked at Flitwick, who was visibly amused. He recovered quickly and laughed. "You want to see a professor duel a second year?" he said. "But if it's Miss Granger, then perhaps it would be a match." He smiled warmly. "In that battle with the basilisk over the summer, her unique shining stone magic impressed me." Professor Flitwick nodded, smiling too. "I wouldn't mind testing myself against a talented young witch, though I don't want my champion title stolen by a newcomer." His tone was teasing, but he, like the rest, was genuinely curious about Hermione's real capabilities. All eyes turned to her. Hermione ran a hand through her bushy hair, wondering how she'd become the center of attention once again. She glanced at Professor McGonagall and the other senior staff. The three women watched with faint amusement rather than concern. After all, this was Lockhart, not Lucius. "Do I have to fight a professor every year in the first practical class?" she muttered under her breath, then stepped forward. "If you don't mind, I'd like to see what it feels like to face a ranger wizard myself. When students spar with me, everyone refuses to fight." "But can you promise you'll both use full strength?" she added, looking straight at Lockhart and Flitwick. "Not an adult playing at fighting a child. If we're going to do this, I want a real assessment of my combat ability." 106. Close combat. Lockhart looked at the confident little girl before him, bowed like a gentleman, and smiled. "Then it depends on whether Miss Granger can force me to use my full power." In his view, although Hermione possessed incredibly strong Philosopher's Stone magic, she was still only a 12-year-old girl. There was a big gap in magical power, accumulation, and experience between them. As long as he kept his guard up, he wouldn't end up like Lucius. Defeating her would take patience and technique. "All right, I'll be the commentator and referee. Everyone, back up a little," Professor Flitwick said. He clapped his hands and moved the onlookers back, expanding the combat area to roughly the size of the Great Hall. Duels between wizards involved potent magic and required room to maneuver. Professor McGonagall helped, using an undetectable extension charm to enlarge the lawn so everyone could stand comfortably and clearly see. Invisible currents of wind formed a transparent hemisphere around the two duelists. Hermione and Lockhart faced one another about 10 meters apart. Lockhart held a short wand in his right hand and a sword in his left, the blade half hidden beneath his cloak like a coiled viper. Hermione lowered her stance slightly, the tip of her silver-white long staff aimed forward. Flitwick's commentary began at the opportune moment. "Before the duel begins, I should explain the stances of the two combatants. After all, our main purpose here is teaching." Neither in the arena showed impatience. Both watched each other intently, reading every subtle movement. Professor Lockhart's wand posture is a standard wand and sword stance. Wand types vary greatly, so there are many variations in how one holds a wand, but the key element is the sword hand. Students above third year have learned a dueling category called wand and sword combat. Although Gryffindor was famous for close combat, Hogwarts' mastery in this area doesn't match Durmstrang's. Professor Lockhart is clearly very proficient. Those of you who aspire to master this technique should study the coordination between his wand and longsword. Because Professor Lockhart is left-handed, he holds his sword in his left hand. Young students should not imitate this without training. As for Miss Granger, though she has only just started her second year and hasn't deeply studied wand postures, her combat movements are remarkably sound. With today's diversity of wands, everyone must find the most suitable hold for their own wand. Miss Granger's current style is an excellent example of long-staff technique. "Professor, hurry up and let them start," George shouted from the crowd. The two had held their poses a long time, and Flitwick's explanations were keeping the duel on pause. "Oh, sorry, now, let the duel begin." On cue, Hermione's wand tip spat several shining stone pebbles toward Lockhart. He answered with a volley of spells that extinguished them all. "Beautiful spell counter," Flitwick called. Before he could elaborate, the arena erupted into sudden motion. Lockhart spun and with a snap appeared abruptly behind Hermione. The longsword, hidden beneath his cloak, stabbed straight for the girl's waist, and his short wand was already drawing a spell. "It's apparition," someone cried. Professor McGonagall had temporarily lifted the school's restriction before the duel, allowing Lockhart to apparate. "That's not fair," Harry yelled. Lily grabbed his ear from behind and made him quiet. The sequence in the arena was lightning quick. Hermione, as if expecting it, had already begun to turn. She swung her long staff horizontally to shove the stabbing sword aside, but Lockhart, smiling, pointed his short wand at her head and cast Petrificus Totalus. Against an opponent who couldn't apparate and who was unprepared, such a coordinated sneak attack was devastatingly effective. Even when the defender blocked the sword, many duelists relaxed, assuming a melee fighter's greatest threat was the blade and neglecting the wand. If Petrificus Totalus struck, the duel would be over. Hermione, however, was not merely a 12-year-old girl. At her core, she was a finger witch with the battle memories of an Elden Lord. She had seen this move before. Dobby's crude attempts had hinted at similar tactics, though Lockhart's execution was more systematic. At the same time, Petrificus Totalus shot from his wand tip. A blade of light erupted from Hermione's wand. As her staff parried the longsword, the wand was already aimed at Lockhart. In close quarters, there was little difference between the speed of Petrificus Totalus and the sudden surge of her blade of light. The indestructible blade of light sliced through the grayish spell and drove upward toward Lockhart's chin. He tilted his head back at the last moment, the blade whistling past, and with a backward push of his foot, he flew away like a drifting snowflake. The air still smelled scorched. If he had dodged even a little slower, he would have been impaled or worse, split by the finishing downward cleave. "Phew, are you trying to kill your professor?" Lockhart exclaimed, eyes wide as he regarded the composed girl. Hermione's gaze burned with fierce resolve. "I imagine this level of difficulty won't trouble you." Lockhart laughed, amused and impressed. "Ha, a troublesome little girl. I truly can't be careless with you. Lucius's loss wasn't unjust." Flitwick raised his voice over the crowd. "What a thrilling close-quarters exchange. Our warnings are not without cause. Close-quarters combat for wizards is lethal. Any slight oversight can be your downfall. Professor Lockhart's apparition sneak attack is a very high-difficulty technique. Even seventh years should not attempt it lightly. You must hold focus, calculate your landing precisely, read your opponent's movements, and have a keen sense of space. Or you might collide with the enemy's wand, or drive your sword into the ground." And Miss Granger's response was perfect. I would even add 10 points to Gryffindor. Her reflexes, using the long staff to block while embedding counter magic within her defense. It's an artistic display of defensive counterattack. Harry, watching from the sidelines, was electrified. This was exactly the close-quarters wizardry he'd dreamed of. "The longsword's still too weak," he blurted. "If it were my chain gamma, Hermione wouldn't be able to stop it." Ron cut through Harry's fantasy flatly. "You'll have to learn apparition first, and besides, Hermione wouldn't let you get that close." "Blast him, boss!" Colin cheered, pumping his fists. In the arena, the two duelists separated again, pacing slowly with steady steps, feeling for weaknesses. Expelliarmus! Lockhart shouted first this time. He fired with his right hand and, at the same time, subtly pointed his left-hand sword at the ground beneath Hermione. A patch of swamp quietly formed where her feet were. Silent casting combined with dual-track casting. This is the true power of a Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, Flitwick praised. Hermione didn't flinch. She flicked her wand to deflect the Expelliarmus, then slammed her staff into the ground. A finite incantatum burst out and dispelled the transfigured swamp. The crowd murmured in astonishment. Such powerful magic! Miss Granger at 12 can dispel a professor's transfiguration. Some weaker professors might not have managed that. Professor Lockhart cast Expelliarmus openly while secretly performing a transfiguration with his left hand, channeling magic through an ordinary longsword. His non-wand hand casting and dual-track coordination are impressive. Look, they're about to clash spells. After several probing exchanges, the two duelists finally settled into a rhythm of violent counterspells, each testing and answering the other's moves in an escalating, dangerous dance. The spells met in midair and detonated into a spray of brilliant sparks. Hermione's Shining Stone's swift pebbles, combined with night pebbles and surprise pebbles, wove a lethal net of firepower that blurred into a shimmer to the naked eye. With the golden snitch keystone she carried, she didn't need to conserve energy. The swift pebbles were blindingly fast. The night pebbles carried a black mist that warped sight and direction, and the surprise pebbles struck silently from behind. If Hermione had this output when she faced Lucius, she could probably have pinned him in place. Short of using defensive artifacts, there was no better counter. Lockhart, however, matched her in skill. He tapped his sword with his short wand, enchanting the blade, then fought with both hands. One wand hurling spells to shatter incoming magic, the other slicing the surprise pebbles with a silver gleam. He even fired new spells to disrupt Hermione's attacks. His repertoire was varied, obstacle charms to trip her, bat bogey hexes and flocks of conjured birds to meet the pebbles, and other charms Hermione couldn't immediately name. To be safe, she answered with overwhelming firepower, but some unfamiliar hexes made her head spin and pulled her out of rhythm briefly. This is classic Ravenclaw tactics, a dazzling display of charms, Professor Flitwick crowed. I'd award Professor Lockhart extra points if he weren't Dean of Slytherin. Rumor has it the Sorting Hat nearly put him in Ravenclaw. Professor, you're off topic again, Fred complained, but he didn't take his eyes off the arena. Lockhart's style did indeed mirror Flitwick's, casting an endless stream of spells to constrict an opponent's options, deflect attacks, and create openings. Watch, soon he'll show you his suppressive technique. Sure enough, when Hermione slipped a stupefy into her barrage, Lockhart didn't parry or slice it. He flicked his short wand and reflected the red bolt back along the exact path it had come. A reflection charm. Only a consummate wizard can pull that off, Flitwick shouted. Reflection requires not just speed, but an understanding of one's opponent. It can immediately turn an attacker's own spell against them. In a standard duel, the effect could be devastating. Last year, when Hermione used Kalia's retaliation against a Death Eater, McGonagall had mistaken it for a reflection. She'd arrived a second late and only seen the aftermath. Inside the arena, Hermione kept her rhythm. She countered her own reflected stupefy with her staff, dodged a sweeping leglocker curse, then sent forth a shining stone meteor, followed by a concealed immobilizing charm to unmake the stones Lockhart threw back. Careful, Hermione. I'm about to use a high-powered spell, Lockhart called, exhilarated and eager to show off. I'd be honored, she replied, continuing to handle the hail of magic. McGonagall on the sidelines tensed, but a glance up at the castle sent the worry away. Dumbledore was watching. Lockhart apparated for a sneak attack, popping up behind Hermione. His long sword flashed with a shifting purplish-gray glow as he lunged, while his short wand came down in a crushing arc. The students frowned. Hadn't he already tried that? It seemed unlikely to work again against a focused opponent. But Lockhart had anticipated the thought. During the earlier exchange, he'd secretly cast a weakening charm on his sword and masked it with a sharpening charm's light. If Hermione blocked as before, her staff would fly from her hand on contact. Hermione, however, had the combat memories the Tarnished had given her. She wouldn't rely on the same move twice. She spun and slammed her staff down in a wide arc. A wave of purple energy radiated out, gravity repulsion. Not the rote gravity spells from class, but a combat technique more like those used by Rodden or the Black and White Kings. It didn't pull foes in, it shoved them away. Magic needn't be confined to form. Gravity, above all, rewards skill. The blast hurled Lockhart several meters back, but he was ready. Even as he was pushed, his short wand completed its descent and unleashed a fully charged blasting curse. The explosion blew up at point-blank range. Fire and smoke clawed into the air and wrapped around Hermione. "Hermione!" gasped the spectators. McGonagall moved to rush in, thinking of calling Madame Pomfrey, but Professor Sprout held her back. "Don't move. Phileas isn't reacting. He can see something we can't." Flitwick indeed stared at the smoke with unwavering attention. Dumbledore and the tower made no move. Their calm reassured McGonagall. The scene, girl swallowed by smoke, a blast from a blasting curse, was hauntingly like the first-year practical class, yet she had to trust the teachers who stayed composed. From the roiling cloud a figure broke through, and a brilliant light blade slashed down. Beside Hermione, the blue-glowing snitch keystone zipped in furious circles, and a cracked shield charm shimmered and then faded. The snitch keystone's barrier had taken the brunt of the blasting curse. Lockhart didn't test whether his enchanted sword could parry that blade. A gust of force sent him tumbling off his feet. Hermione's heavy strike had missed, leaving a black scorch on the arena floor. Before he could recover, the snitch keystone darted with the momentum of a shining stone meteor and slammed into him. Lockhart could only whirl his cloak and be driven another 10 meters to the edge of the arena. "Your little pet is aggressive," he panted. "This arena isn't suited to this sort of duel." Had the snitch kept up the chase in such cramped quarters, he'd have been forced to dodge continuously with no room to cast. With Hermione's firepower and the snitch's mobility, he stood little chance in close quarters. Hermione opened her mouth to reply. Then the arena itself stretched. The dueling circle that had been roughly the size of the Great Hall expanded outward until it rivaled the Quidditch pitch. She and Lockhart were so far apart, they were mere specks. "Did Dumbledore extend the field?" someone murmured. Only with the castle's deepest magics, and perhaps the aid of the Philosopher's Stone within it, could anyone achieve such a extension charm on that scale. Every inch of Hogwarts was steeped in enchantment. To stretch its space like that took enormous power. The dueling ground now felt both distant and intimate, like looking at the castle from outside and seeing it as simultaneously vast and small, an imposing peak that could slip through a narrow crevice with ease. Hermione looked up toward the castle. At the top of the tower, a mischievous pair of eyes seemed to wink at her. "That old man really enjoys a show," she murmured. "He doesn't mind making things bigger, does he?" She glanced over at Lockhart and shrugged. "Professor, now we can really get moving." Lockhart chuckled, a little forced. Yes. Dumbledore will be delighted to see me get bested by you, but since you called for help first, I suppose I ought to bring a partner." He pointed at the golden snitch skittering around Hermione. Hermione didn't refuse. She watched as Lockhart flourished his cloak, and with an absurd little flourish, produced a tall hippogriff as if pulling a cape from a matador's jacket. He patted its flank, vaulted up onto its back, and grinned. "Don't say I won by coward's tricks. Next you'll be facing aerial cavalry. Borrow a broom from Madame Hooch, if you must." Hermione smiled. In this world, relatively few wizards had mastered true flight magic, even those who had rarely used it in actual combat. She was different. Over the past year, she had practiced gravity magic diligently. She still found it hard to fly and fight freely at the same time, but she had learned how easily she could restrict an opponent's flight. She raised her wand and let the invisible tug of gravity spread outward. "Let's see how high you can get, Professor," she said. Lockhart felt the change immediately. He urged the hippogriff to leap and spread its wings, but the creature suddenly seemed to weigh hundreds of pounds. Even with frantic flapping, it could barely hold 3 meters above the ground, and doing so drained it quickly. "What kind of charm is this? An anti-levitation?" Lockhart blurted, and tried a levitation charm on the hippogriff. It helped a little, but the bird could still only keep low and was sluggish and clumsy. I'm starting round 2. Hermione wasn't unaffected either. Maintaining gravity magic cost her energy. She cast another spell, Cloud Mist. A thick, whitish fog bloomed across the dueling arena like low-lying clouds. 2 meters of mist rose up and completely hid Hermione's position. Lockhart, riding the hippogriff above the murk, looked like a figure perched over the clouds, unable to see what moved below. "Oh no!" the students outside cried. "We can't see anything!" Professor Flitwick's voice carried over the crowd. The cloud mist charm is old-fashioned, but effective. It's a classic way to disguise movement for aerial attackers. Of course, you could use a disillusionment charm or transfiguration to conceal yourself as well. "Hurricane lift," Lockhart countered. He circled above the arena on the hippogriff, flicked his short wand, and enchanted the creature's wings. Powerful gusts began to beat down, helping him gain speed and blowing the concentrated mist upward so it scattered. But Hermione had not remained on the ground. She had already cast a levitation charm on herself and a disillusionment charm. When the wind struck, she rose up into the clearing fog. "Aha! Clever!" Flitwick crowed. "This invisibility effect is even better than a disillusionment charm, better than many invisibility cloaks." Everyone searched the mist for her, but without Moody's magical eye, none of them could detect her. A sharp blue light stabbed upward from below, and the golden snitch spun into the scramble, distracting Lockhart. He guided the hippogriff and waved his wand to bat the snitch away, but then Hermione dropped out of the sky. Cragshard! Like the spell he'd seen used before, a jagged cone of magic hurtled down with earth-shattering power. The tip struck the translucent dueling barrier with a loud clang. In the shifting light of the fight, Lockhart thought, for a fraction of a second, that he saw 2 little girls laughing behind Hermione. They seemed to say something to him, and then they were gone. The glimpse stunned him, and he faltered. He could only throw up a shield charm and try to endure, but his barrier shuddered under the impact. The hippogriff and Lockhart were driven toward the ground. Cracks spidered across the shield. "Incendio!" Lockhart cried, blasting a pillar of fire upward before the curtain of light collapsed. Hermione ran along the fluorescent edge of the shield charm, flipped clear, and fired several shining stone pebbles midair. The pebbles struck, and the shield's light wall crumbled completely. The hippogriff tried to climb again, but the golden snitch darted round them like a tiny bolt of lightning, constantly harrying and confusing the flight. Lockhart sent a flock of conjured birds to chase the snitch away, and turning to search for Hermione, saw a bright blue glow on the rim of the dueling arena. She had landed, and already put some distance between them. Under the combined effects of Hermione's gravity binding and her levitation charm, she drifted as light as a snowflake. A breeze could carry her. From the farthest point of the ring, she drew a large bow of compressed magic. Loretta's great bow, the same shining stone magic that had once severely wounded the basilisk, condensed into the string. Lockhart's face went hard. He knew he had to stop her before the bow reached full charge, but she stood over 100 meters away. The hippogriff couldn't close the distance under the gravity pull, and the snitch's interference made matters worse. Lockhart chose to abandon the hippogriff, leaving it to contend with the snitch, and apparated himself, appearing behind Hermione with a pop and slashing down with his sword. It was exactly the outcome Hermione had expected. Lockhart favored surprise apparitions. He had used the trick twice before. His enchanted blade cut through the girl who had been concentrating on the bow, and passed through as if through mist. The woman he had attacked was only an illusion. The distance and the residual magic had kept Lockhart from spotting it in time. When the illusion shattered, several pale blue light swords lingered, inactive, shining swords. The Royal Magic Knights of Calia were known for casting shining sword arrays. The magical shining sword was the basic prototype of that kind of formation. The apparent magical fluctuations of those swords had convinced Lockhart the Hermione in front of him was real. As the decoy dissolved, the blue swords sprang to life and flew at Lockhart in a tight cluster. He parried desperately, blocking the barrage as best he could, but a couple of the blades nicked him and ripped his robes. He staggered, his appearance utterly disheveled. "Professor, I win." Hermione's voice came calm from the far edge of the arena. The illusion gone, the real Hermione stood with Loretta's great bow fully charged and its light at its tightest. Had she fired while Lockhart was still occupied with the shining sword trap, the result would have been obvious. Lockhart held up his hands and gave a rueful smile. "I surrender." He hesitated. "I kept picturing the scene where the basilisk was wounded by your sword. I focused so much on that magic I lost my head." Hermione smiled and dispelled the great bow. "I took a shortcut," she said, and the bow winked out in her hands. The undetectable extension enchantment that had made the ring so large faded away, and the dueling circle shrank back to its original size. "But, Professor," Hermione began, sharp-eyed. She'd seen it the moment Lockhart's expression flickered. If he hadn't blanked for a heartbeat, she wouldn't have been able to press him so relentlessly. "You lost focus for a moment during the fight. That's why I could keep you on the defensive." Lockhart's face went suddenly softer. "I was thinking of my two elder sisters," he said with an odd, wistful tone. "If they'd lived, they might have been fine witches, perhaps even as gifted as you." He straightened, then smiled with theatrical gallantry. "Be that as it may, I've been beaten. As a first-year Miss Granger, your combat ability already surpasses that of many adult wizards. A splendid demonstration. Gryffindor gets 10 points. "Hey, Lockhart, don't steal my job," Professor Flitwick piped up, mock-offended. "You handle the dueling, I handle the points. We agreed on that." At once, George and Fred Weasley began a cheer from the crowd, voices lifting into a chant. "Granger beat the Slytherin head. Granger beat the Slytherin head." They dragged nearly everyone but the Slytherins, into a conga line and began parading across the lawn, twisting and dancing. Colin waved his wand like a paintbrush and scattered a riot of color into the air. The younger Gryffindors bounced and laughed until McGonagall's stern gaze pinned them into stillness. Whether Dumbledore had watched the duel from the tower and approved remained unknown, but Hermione herself was quietly satisfied. Flitwick clapped his hands and brought the students back to order. Undoubtedly a magnificent duel. Both combatants displayed practical skill far beyond the ordinary. Professor Lockhart's ghost-like evasions and Miss Granger's iron wall defense and inexhaustible tactics. Well done, both of you. Students in 5th year and above, after this lesson, you will write an observation essay on the duel and submit it to Professor Lockhart before next week's class. No fewer than 10 lines. A groan rose from the older students. Practical lessons had never demanded essays before. "All right," Flitwick added, seeing the delay. "We've dawdled long enough. This year's practical dueling class officially begins." Since Lockhart was new in the Defense Against the Dark Arts chair, Flitwick had volunteered to cover many of the organizational duties. "You used a lot of energy in that bout, Gilderoy. Rest for now. The other professors will sort the sparring groups. I'll keep an eye on the first years." He gave Lockhart an affectionate nudge with his foot. "Miss Granger, you don't need to spar either. I doubt even a 7th year would enjoy fighting you. Rest with Professor Lockhart on the sideline." Hermione was happy enough to accept. She suspected most of the next 6 years' practical classes would consist of doing homework while other people sparred. She sat on a bench at the edge of the courtyard and watched. The older years were more exciting, varied, flashy spells and confident tactics. The Weasley twins were deceptively adept at two-person combat. Their coordination was uncanny, and their two enchanted top hats worked together to produce unpredictable effects. Their problem, Hermione noticed, was playfulness. They would sometimes forfeit a clear advantage for the sake of a prank, as if teasing mattered more than victory. That sort of indulgence might be harmless in a friendly match, but fatal in a real fight. Percy was the opposite, painfully by the book, all rigid technique and textbook spells. His style tried to imitate Professor Flitwick down to the mannerisms. He was effective enough on paper, but predictability let opponents catch him out. So despite excellent academic marks, Percy rarely topped the practical rankings. Injuries were common in the older students' bouts, but with Lily and Madame Pomfrey on hand, even nasty scratches were swiftly attended. The students felt free to push themselves. The younger years were messier. Hermione found herself pinching her lips at some matches, like an Elden Lord watching a novice tackle a great guardian, and wanting both to help and to let them learn. Harry, now allowed to use his chain scythe in combat, fought in wide, sweeping arcs after enchanting the weapon to his wand. Second years didn't have many ways to create distance. Rolling and tactical footsteps were their main tools. Under Hermione's coaching, Harry used a slow, fast, feint, raise the scythe high to bait an early roll, then follow up a step later while the opponent was winded. The treatise she'd given him for his birthday had clearly helped. His timing and measure were methodical. Ron was Harry's foil. He'd trained with a small round shield that shimmered bluely and focused on defensive counterattacks. He'd been learning a shield charm and had turned himself into something like a walking turtle shell, hard to crack. When Harry finally tried the Carrion Swiftblade, Hermione had taught him, still awkward with it. Ron seized the opening and finished with a well-timed Petrificus Totalis. First-year offensive magic still had its limits. Many of the small curses couldn't pierce a resolved defense. Neville had improved massively since last year. His scabbard wand, a heavy, iron-like bar rumored to contain mercury, lent him surprising magic resistance and weight behind his swings. He'd learned a magic weapon spell and combined that with a knack for finding openings. Draco Malfoy, too, had shown promise, narrowly losing to Harry and Ron, but defeating Neville with clever spellwork. His popularity, however, was abysmal. Aside from professors, Dobby, and his mother, the school paid him no mind. He kept to the library like a lone spirit. The first years were chaos. Tiny Flitwick worked the crowd at their height, shouting reminders about rolling properly and warning them not to aim for each other's eyes. A foul. Ginny Weasley's wand, nicknamed Guns N' Roses, emitted startling bangs that unsettled opponents and made some mispronounce their incantations. A few Muggle-born children cried from the noise. Colin painted sticky colors that stuck to faces and took ages to remove, which usually ended with someone bigger tackling him and returning the paint in spades. Then there was Luna Lovegood from Ravenclaw, whose odd, distant manner masked a knack for slipping out of tight spots with minor clever spells, a sort of miniature Hermione. Lockhart returned with a silver tray of blackberry cookies and 2 glasses of lemonade. "Have some," he said grandly. "You used a lot of energy in that fight. I asked Dobby to fetch afternoon tea." Hermione accepted gratefully and began nibbling like a contented hamster. Lockhart watched her for a moment with unusual intensity. "You fight very differently from how you look now," he said. "Do I?" Hermione shrugged. She'd never considered it. Apart from the finger witch joke that had circulated and the undeniable influence of some darker memories she'd absorbed, memories of the Tarnished turning into an Elden Lord, her fighting had always felt natural. "No one's ever told you?" Lockhart sounded almost surprised. "In combat, you're like the cold wind over the tundra, clinical, emotionless, calculating every possibility, able to spot the tiniest flaw. You're brave, too. Spells bring you uncomfortably close sometimes, as if you've already measured the distance in your head. I've faced many terrible things, but no one has given me the same pressure you do." He spoke with feeling. It was true that the duel had drained him, wave after wave of steady attack, pressure that allowed almost no respite, and several dangerously close exchanges. Yet here sat the cheerful little girl, tucking into cookies as if nothing had happened. Hermione turned that over. So that was the manner of the Tarnished, cold, relentless, precise. No wonder such a demeanor had felled so many foes. "Young wizards don't often like close combat," Lockhart went on, glancing at the sparring older students. "I admire your style. It's rare." He produced a slim notebook from his coat with a flourish. "I've written down some fighting insights not in the textbooks, little notes from my travels. After taking this post, I collected them into a booklet. Perhaps you'll find them useful." Hermione took the notebook and slipped it into her bag. Lockhart shrugged, half amused. "I never thought I'd lose to a 12-year-old and then be asked to teach her." "You're being modest, Professor," Hermione said, and then, suddenly deciding she couldn't accept his notebook without giving something back, she tore a few blank pages from the back of her own notes. Quick as a flash, she scrawled, and soon slid several pages into his hand. "These are the key points for Loretta's Great Bow," she said. "You might like them." Lockhart blinked. He knew the reputation of Loretta's Great Bow, shining stone magic, compacted into a single, horribly destructive point of energy with tremendous range. Many had tried to recreate it after Hermione's odd summer feat against the basilisk. Most had failed. The spell provided an answer to a gap in his own repertoire. He liked surprise and improvisation, but lacked a high-power, long-range strike that could end a fight decisively. Hermione, for her part, wasn't worried about Lockhart's lack of a philosopher's stone. In a world saturated with ambient magic, an external stone was an aid, not an absolute requirement. Even without one, a wizard could still turn the tide with the right technique. "You're giving this to me?" Lockhart said, incredulous and delighted. "Thank you, Hermione." "Enjoy the cookies," she said, and took another bite. From the center of the crowd, Flitwick called, "Gilderoy, you've rested long enough. Don't forget you're the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor." He was bouncing on his toes, clearly in need of Lockhart's help with the mass of students. Lockhart rose with a gracious bow and set off to take charge of the sparring, the notebook and Hermione's pages safe in his hand. 110. A brief private conversation. Meanwhile, inside the castle and unnoticed by anyone watching the duel, a short, fierce private conversation was underway. Narcissa Malfoy had been supposed to be on standby at the dueling grounds with Madame Pomfrey, but two younger students had ended up in the infirmary after stuffing too many slug pellets into each other's mouths to avoid facing their opponents. So she had stayed behind in the castle, tending those troublesome children, though she suspected they had engineered their injuries to escape the contest. After tucking them into bed, she slipped to the window and watched the practical class on the lawn. Draco stood among the crowd like a statue. His handsome, distinctly Malfoy face and pale blonde hair were hard to miss to a mother's eye, even if he tried to fade into the background. This year's first practical lesson was turning out differently. Amid the students' jeers, the celebrated Platinum Knight seemed poised to duel Hermione Granger. Narcissa's feelings about Hermione were tangled and raw. The girl had been the reason Lucius was in Azkaban, had torn the family apart, and had disgraced the Malfoy name. And yet, Hermione had also saved Hogwarts. Lucius's deeds had been beyond even the loose moral bounds of many pure-blood families. Sending children to be traded away for power was monstrous. In a private, uncomfortable corner of her heart, Narcissa felt gratitude to the girl who had rescued Draco from the worst of that upbringing. Since the scandal, Hermione had never spared them the hateful looks other pupils reserved for the Malfoys. Because of her, much of the open ostracism had been avoided. If the professors could be objective, some students still would not have been. Lost in those thoughts, Narcissa watched Professor McGonagall briefly lower the apparition restriction and the duel intensify. Then came a sharp, sudden crack. She flinched and drew out a wand, an ordinary school-issue wand. Once she had possessed a black family wand, an Ollivander's masterpiece, but after the raid on Malfoy Manor, she had sold it to help pay part of Draco's tuition. After the Malfoys fell, Draco had to cover his own incidental school expenses like any other child. She would not let him take a work-study placement or leave the castle. There were too many enemies who would be delighted to see the Malfoy line die out. She endured his tantrums and kept him at Hogwarts, at least until the uproar died down. Below the window, a small, ragged figure had appeared, the instant the apparition restriction thinned. He was burned and scarred, pustules half-healed into puckered tissue, skin like dried leather. His limbs were thin as twigs, and he smelled sharply of rot. Narcissa nearly cried out and then stilled herself. She recognized him in one glance. Dobby, their house elf. She closed the shutters soundlessly and cast a quick soundproofing charm. A thin, ghost-repelling ward went up behind the curtain. She could not risk Peeves or anything else interrupting this fragile, private moment. "Dobby, why are you here? What did Lucius send you to do? Did he try to make you kill Hermione?" Her voice shook, part relief at seeing a familiar face, part fear. "Mistress, Dobby is glad to see Mistress again," Dobby rasped. The speech was weak, and he sobbed beneath it. He had been recovering in the wilderness for weeks, being hunted and living rough, had done nothing for an elf's constitution. If it were not for the magical bond that let him sense his family, he would never have found Hogwarts again. Narcissa hurried to the medical cabinet and fumbled out ointments she remembered from years beside Madame Pomfrey. She smoothed salves over burnt skin and washed the worst of the grime away. Dobby let her work, choking the words out between sobs. Master told Dobby to protect Mistress and young Master, and if Dobby has an opportunity, to kill Hermione Granger. Dobby does not want to kill Mistress, but Dobby could not get into Hogwarts by other means, so Dobby had to find Miss Granger. Dobby is useless. Dobby could not kill her. He bowed his head and, as if to punish himself, began to bang it against the floor. Narcissa grabbed him before he could hurt himself. The sudden fierceness of the grip surprised even her. "Is that what he's thinking?" she whispered, fury hollowing her voice. "He's locked away in the dungeon and won't come out to rescue us, but he told you to abandon us here and to take a life for his pride?" "Dobby does not know, Mistress." Dobby whimpered. "Master said it was pointless for him to try to come out, and that if he died, Dobby should obey Mistress and young Master." Narcissa folded against the wall as if the words themselves were a physical blow. A hard, cold grief gathered behind her eyes. What could Lucius have been thinking? What shred of vanity made him throw away every duty to his family? Dobby picked up a fallen jar of salve with shaking hands, tears still wet on his cheeks. "Mistress need not fear. Now Dobby is inside Hogwarts. Dobby can protect Mistress and young Master, and Dobby will have a chance to kill Hermione Granger." The words were like ice. Narcissa's skin prickled. She moved to the window and watched the duel. Lockhart and Hermione were locked in the final exchange, spells and light arcing between them. She knew that the moment a victor was declared, Professor McGonagall would raise the apparition barrier again. If Dobby remained, he would be trapped and discovered. "You cannot stay here," Narcissa said, calmer than she felt. She turned back to him, and in a voice that brooked no argument, continued, "You are not to try anything again. You belong to me now as much as to him." She hardly liked admitting it aloud. She had always been his mistress, but she would not let any other reading of the bond endanger her son. "But Master's orders," Dobby began. "You will not hide in the kitchens," Narcissa cut him off. "Other house elves will see you and drag you out. You will be recognized and exposed. If they find you here, they will use you to get to me and Draco." Dobby's large eyes filled. "But where, Mistress?" "Go outside, hide, keep away from people. Take these." She shoved the cloth bag of ointments, dressings, and a little food into his arms. She had to think of a plausible explanation for Madame Pomfrey later. She would manage, but Dobby's safety mattered more. "Now," she ordered. "Leave at once." A look of confusion and gratitude passed over him. Narcissa seized the moment. She pushed him toward the window. Dobby stumbled, then collapsed into a shimmering vortex with a faint pop. For an instant, Narcissa heard the comforting, sealed sensation as McGonagall reasserted the anti-apparition charm. The professor had been no more than punctual. Relief washed through her, sharp and immediate. But it was a small relief, overlaid with an aching loneliness. She wanted to cry, to let the exhaustion and indignation out, but she could not. Draco depended on her. She had to be steady. 1 or 11, birthday gift. At night, Hermione curled up in a single armchair in the room of requirement, absorbed in Lockhart's notes on practical combat. Harry and Ron, meanwhile, were still in the middle of their duel. Since his narrow loss to Ron earlier that day, Harry had been obsessed with the shield charm. In his mind, Ron's magic shield was still new. Even with the round shield wand enhancing it, it shouldn't be able to hold out against his spells forever. Harry insisted Ron's victory had been a fluke, that he'd been careless and failed to dodge. If he stayed alert, breaking that turtle shell was only a matter of time. Ron, on the other hand, gloated that no matter how fierce Harry's chain scythe was, it would inevitably be stopped by his absolute defense. After class, they'd kept sparring in the room of requirement, only pausing to eat. They'd rearranged the room into a large dueling arena in the center and had Dobby deliver plenty of food, preparing for a decisive battle. Hermione, worried they'd get carried away and hurt each other, pulled Neville over to watch while she finished the new book she'd been reading. In the arena, one side constantly looked for openings, testing Ron's defensive weaknesses, while the other tried every angle to blunt Harry's incredibly powerful hammer-like attacks, occasionally countering when an opportunity appeared. Neville sat nearby, looking puzzled as he tried to puzzle out a way past Ron's turtle shell, but his scabbard wand simply wasn't as rawly powerful as Harry's chain scythe. Enchanted weapons under his control didn't swell in strength the way Harry's did. He still had a long way to go if brute force was his plan. Hermione only half listened to them. Most of her attention was on Lockhart's book. The notebook contained his usual tricks, spell variations, rhetorical pacing for incantations, and methods for misleading an opponent about the nature of your spell. The most interesting material concerned his use of the memory charm and confundo. Lockhart seemed unusually adept at memory magic. He had shortened Obliviate's incantation and simplified its gestures, turning what should be an awkward, obscure spell into something usable in combat. Where ordinary memory charms and confundos were usually employed against Muggles to make them forget things or ignore objects, and rarely worked well on determined wizards, Lockhart took a different approach. In battle, he used short incantations and concealed gestures to cast weakened Obliviates and confundos that could make an opponent instantaneously forget the spell they were about to cast, or become briefly disoriented and mistake an ally for an enemy. The effect lasted only a moment, but combined with his style, surprise attacks and close-quarters fighting, that moment could leave an opponent flustered and unable to cope with his onslaught. The spells that had made Hermione dizzy and given her a headache during their duel had been of that variety, but she had been too cautious. She countered unfamiliar Lockhart spells with concentrated firepower, and the little that got through had no effect. Most of her Shining Stone magic, unlike ordinary magic, didn't rely on fixed gestures and words, so Lockhart couldn't judge her casting rhythm and couldn't interrupt her effectively. Surrounded by layers of Shining Stone magic, which was more volatile and idiosyncratic than standard spells, a weak memory charm had little to no effect on her. Still, she broke out in a cold sweat. She hadn't appreciated before how skilled the wizards of this world were at manipulating the mind. Most magic in the Forbidden Land emphasized brute power and was weak on mental control, with the notable exception of the Torina series of charm and sleep magic. Few factions specialized in memory or mental domination. The wizards, by contrast, had cultivated that path. The Imperious Curse, one of the 3 unforgivable curses, was an obvious example. Hermione scolded herself for underestimating them. Their magic covered a wider range and approached something like omnipotence. Lockhart's loss to her didn't mean he was powerless. If put on a battlefield, he would be a terrifying spearhead, skilled apparition behind enemy lines, wide-reaching confundos and memory charms to disrupt an enemy's rear, and dangerous close combat skill. With a flask of Polyjuice Potion 2, any leader could be vulnerable to assassination. His weakness remained clear, though. He lacked powerful siege capabilities. He excelled at one-on-one engagements, but would struggle against fortresses or monsters. Yet with the great bow Hermione had given him, even that weakness might be compensated for, and he would become even more troublesome. Hermione had learned a lot from Lockhart's notes. Merely learning practical battlefield uses for memory charms and confundos went far beyond Hogwarts instruction. Even the Weasley twins and Percy's textbooks treated those spells superficially. Hogwarts apparently wouldn't teach students how to tamper with memories. These lessons were left at an introductory level. Rubbing her eyes, Hermione closed the book. It was nearly midnight. Only in the room of requirement could one legitimately stay up this late. Hogwarts's curfew at 9 felt positively draconian. She looked over at the 3 boys. Harry and Ron, exhausted from fighting, were now sprawled on the floor, recuperating with no concern for appearances. Neville still looked thoughtful, puzzling over the duel. With a sudden pop, Dobby appeared carrying a large cake. "Which young wizard ordered a birthday cake?" he asked. Harry jumped up. "Hey, Dobby, I told you to just put the cake down quietly. Now there's no surprise at all." Ron and Neville groaned, regretting their ruined plan. Dobby put the cake on a nearby table and explained, "This is not Dobby. Dobby is dealing with leftover food from Aragog's spiders. Dobby sent me to deliver the cake." "Oh, Merlin's beard, this is unlucky. Dobby, you all look the same," Ron complained. Hermione watched them with amusement. The cake wasn't fancy. Dobby had tried, but limited supplies showed. The pink cake had only a thin layer of cream, and "Happy Birthday, Hermione" was scrawled crookedly across the top. It was clearly meant for her. The clock chimed midnight. It was September 19th. She had forgotten her birthday again. "All right." Harry said helplessly, "Since it's come to this, Hermione, happy birthday." The three of them simultaneously produced the gifts they'd planned from behind their backs. Nothing expensive, a handwritten card, some candy, and a knitted hat with hilariously uneven stitches. "The three of us knitted this together," Ron said. "It looks awful, but it's very warm." Harry's face went faintly red. Hermione was surprised and delighted. She put the hat on at once. It had two clearly visible seams where three different people had knitted separate sections and stitched them together. The hat's chaotic mix of styles made it strangely perfect. "Thank you. I love it," Hermione said, stroking the fabric, then popped one of the candies into her mouth. "You've taught us so much magic. It's us who should be thanking you." "Enough of that," Neville said earnestly. "Now we have to finish this big cake before we go to sleep. Wasting food is a bad habit." 112. Coming soon. Hermione's birthday caused hardly a ripple. Apart from Harry, who had obtained her birth date from the Book of Admittance through Professor Potter, few people at Hogwarts kept track of birthdays. Even Professor McGonagall only murmured a quiet, happy birthday after class the next day. The reserved professor wasn't given to showing emotion. Everyone else's attention had shifted to the newly built Owl Tower. Thanks to Professor Sprout's relentless work, a ghost owl habitat that went a long way toward restoring a forest-like environment had finally been completed. Hagrid moved the eggs he'd been tending there as well, which meant Hermione no longer had to pass the stench near the Philosopher's Stone Hall when she came and went. The glowing little eggs drew the students' curiosity. When word spread that they were a new species of owl, interest turned to excitement. Kids asked when they could be bought, whether they could raise one, and, given how unreliable ordinary owl post had become, how soon these might solve delivery problems. They brought food, endured the smell, and helped the professors care for the hatchlings. When some of the ghost owls hatched, Professor Kettleburn also brought back adult birds to foster the young. The tower grew smellier by the day. The ghost owls were still in the taming stage and kept showing all the bad habits that took time to break. They eyed every student who came to visit, watching for anything shiny, stealing things by any means, hiding them in nests and burying them beneath foul-smelling droppings, so that even when belongings were recovered, the stench made them worthless. The birds added to the misery with their constant ear-splitting cries. Any attempt at conversation near the tower was drowned out as if only the owls were allowed to make noise in the world. Gradually, students stopped visiting. Only Hagrid, Sprout, and Kettleburn were left to clean, feed, and argue with the birds. Still, the professors were hopeful, especially Newt, who believed the owl's habits weren't irredeemable animal instincts. After a period of magical taming, he argued the ghost owls would calm down and become as useful and loyal as the old magical owls, hardworking, intelligent, and obedient. As student interest in the owls waned, attention shifted to next week's outdoor practical. After Lockhart's defeat at Hermione's hands in the first practical lesson, he was undeterred. He kept promising the class that the planned outdoor practical would go ahead. Once Hogwarts reached the right location, he would take them on their first outdoor course. "I've already planned several routes to ensure every year learns what is suitable for them," he told anyone who stopped him in the corridor or at his office door. The promise made the students even more eager for next week. For the first time, they thought Hogwarts walked too slowly. Fred and George even dared to suggest to Professor McGonagall that the castle hurry up its route, an idea that ended badly for them and nearly had them cleaning the toilets for a month. Hogwarts' walking route was a mystery. Hermione had never seen Dumbledore or McGonagall lay it out. It felt as if they handed control over to the castle itself and let it go where it pleased. Yet, it seldom disappointed. Year after year, it appeared in just the right spots, apparently calculating the best locations, using the lists in the Book of Admittance so the professors could travel the shortest distances to collect the most students. It also seemed to pick nearby places suitable for young wizards selecting their first wands. In that sense, the year's location wasn't so much chosen by the staff as inferred from Hogwarts' own path. Sometimes, Hermione really did think the castle was alive. Even Dumbledore had to reason with it patiently. Its intelligence, however, was chaotic. capable of understanding instructions, but often obstinately silent or dull. Before the Philosopher's Stone was stabilized, McGonagall had lived in a constant state of dread. Hogwarts demanded immense amounts of energy, like an insatiable child, and the unstable stone felt like a ticking bomb. Every morning she rose anxious that some disaster might befall them, imagining even absurd calamities in her worry. Lockhart's outdoor plan was quietly absorbed by the castle. After the professor set his prepared list of locations, figuratively, as the students like to imagine, into a large cauldron in the headmaster's office, Hogwarts quietly shifted its route to include them. But much of the wilderness was desolate, lacking landmarks, and the students had no idea where they'd been taken. Each day they peppered the professors with questions. Where are we today? And where will we go tomorrow? And then indulged in idle guesses about the sorts of challenges their unfamiliar-sounding destinations might present. There wasn't much time for daydreaming, though. Between heavy coursework and the resumption of Quidditch, the students were kept busier than ever. The deans treated Quidditch as a top priority. Gryffindor's victory the previous year had left Professor McGonagall unusually buoyant. She'd been bragging about it to nearly every witch and wizard she met over the summer. From the start of the term, the house's deans called in their Quidditch captains and gave them a single order. Bring a Quidditch cup home at any cost. Do not let Gryffindor hog all the glory again. As a result, many students found their free time eaten up by training and drills. The pitch was alive daily with flurries of colored robes as teams practiced. Harry griped more than once about Captain Wood's strictness, but Hermione was in favor of the intensive training. Though personally not fond of brooms or Quidditch itself, she had other reasons. Her little ghost, an odd, private thing of hers, seemed to thrive on the game's fervor. The shouts of players, the crowd's cheers, the roar after every goal seemed to feed it with a strange kind of power. Keen to capitalize on that energy, Hermione organized a Gryffindor cheer squad. Using Transfiguration, she produced banners, pom-poms, and other support materials, and pulled other housemates into an over-the-top display meant to drown out the opposition. Hufflepuff soon answered in kind, using their numbers to produce a magnificent formation of their own. With loud sound enchantments layered on top, one stand could make the entire Quidditch pitch reverberate. Hermione figured that if the first match had been scheduled before the outdoor practical, Hogwarts itself would have been turned inside out by the noise and the frenzy. Finally, after weeks of waiting, the new practical week had arrived. The outdoor field class everyone had been looking forward to was finally about to begin. As with the first week, the second years were first in line. Naturally, the first years were still confined to textbook work in the classrooms. Harry had been dressed early and paced back and forth in the common room all morning. Even though Oliver Wood had drilled him until curfew the night before, it didn't stop him from fretting like a cat in a thunderstorm. Even if you're on duty for Professor Lockhart, you should at least go down to the Great Hall for breakfast first, the Weasley twins groused. Their own outdoor practicals were tomorrow. Watching the second years leave was a bitter pill. Hermione, unfazed, calmly finished her breakfast. Lockhart was a showman, but he was also dependable. He wouldn't have planned anything beyond their level. Besides, her own abilities made most second-year exercises routine. I hope he hasn't rounded up Cornish pixies, she said, pulling the restless boys along to the Great Hall. Outside on the flying class lawn, Lockhart and Madame Hooch were already waiting. The plan was simple. Everyone would fly out on the school brooms, follow the professor, and return the same way. The castle would not move until every student was back on board. Lockhart had chosen a nearby stretch of wildland that contained a variety of dangerous creatures. This week's field class for every year would take place there. All right, children, I know it's been a hard week for everyone, Lockhart announced with a theatrical clap. I, too, had a sleepless night after being bested by a second-year witch. Terrible for the ego, but instructive, he added with a grin. Professor, what are we going to see today? Harry asked, unable to hide his impatience. Oh, that's a little secret. Let me keep you in suspense. In less than half an hour, you'll see them. I had to work very hard to find them. Lockhart winked mysteriously. Madame Hooch took a sterner tone. Mind your brooms. If you damage a school broom out in the field, you'll be climbing up the castle on an acromantula's back as punishment." She glared over the students. "You're all second years. Some of you play for teams, some of you know how to handle a broom, but do not carry others on your broom, even if it's a bit temperamental." Her look lingered on Hermione. Why, Hooch wondered, was this brilliant little witch so disdainful of brooms? Lockhart had brought his own hippogriff. The students would use the school brooms, Hooch's pride and joy. Even a small scratch would break her heart. Hermione declined the cleanse weep Hooch offered, and instead took up her staff and cast a gravity charm. After all the practice she'd put in, she could fly steadily, though aerial combat could still be awkward. Harry initially thought she'd be slower without a broom, but he didn't know the capabilities of her gravity magic. If she wanted, she could launch herself forward or drop like a meteor. For now, she preferred subtle control, letting herself glide relative to the others, speeding up when they slowed, the physics of it entirely under her command. Once everyone was in the air, Lockhart mounted his hippogriff and led them out past the castle wards. The high-altitude wind stung. Though it was only September, the chill bit at exposed faces. Fortunately, their school robes were charmed for warmth. Lockhart floated ahead, a bright Lumos charm hovering over his head to guide the group as they followed. They flew over low, rounded hills until Lockhart pushed his hippogriff down into the ruins of a village. No one had lived here for decades. Harsh weather and dwindling resources had driven people away. What remained were empty stone cottages, half-collapsed walls, and bare skeletal trees. Torn strips of fabric still clung to flagpoles and whimpered in the wind. In the gray light, the place looked like something out of a fearsome tale. "All right, this is our destination, the haunted hamlet," Lockhart announced, counting heads to be sure no one was missing. "Haunted? Ghosts?" Ron asked, disappointed. He'd already seen plenty of ghosts at the castle. Hermione could handle the lot of them by herself. "Oh no, if it were only ghosts, I wouldn't have had to drag you all out here. Do you know how much responsibility I carry?" Lockhart preened. "No, this hamlet has a different sort of problem. Several very powerful boggarts live here." He pointed to a half-finished stone fort nearby. Muggles had planned to make a settlement here and even began some defenses, but then the boggarts, these ones, drove everyone away. "Now, who can tell me what a boggart is?" Lockhart called. Hermione shot her hand up, ready to snag the points, but Lockhart first selected a Ravenclaw girl. "A boggart is a shape-shifting creature that hides in dark, confined spaces," the girl recited confidently. "They feed on fear. They sense what a person most dreads and take that form. No one knows a boggart's true shape because no one has seen it." "Very good. Ravenclaw gets a point. I'm delighted everyone's been keeping up with the reading," Lockhart said, nodding with exaggerated satisfaction. "And who knows the charm to beat a boggart?" "It's ridiculous," several students answered in unison. "That's right. Ordinary boggarts become whatever frightens you, things under the bed, monsters in the wardrobe, and once you know their weakness, they're not too hard to handle." Lockhart's smile turned a little coy. "But the ones here are not ordinary. These are mutated, rare, and far more dangerous. The usual boggart banishing spell is often ineffective." He made a show of lowering his voice. "I call them pseudo-human boggarts. They can assume human form perfectly, melt into a crowd, and wait for the right moment to strike." He scanned the students with a flourish. "In fact, one of them may already be among you. Haven't you noticed an increase in the number of classmates around you?" There were 19 students in the second year in total. 12 were from the first intake. The other 7 had been rescued by the professors from the Green Flame Party at Christmas. But counting heads now, there were 20. Lockhart had started a head count as soon as he landed, not only to confirm numbers, but to check whether any boggarts had slipped in. He wasn't truly worried that a boggart would physically harm the children. Even a mutated one had no real attack power. It would only make the outdoor practical lesson more interesting. In a village, a boggart that could take human form was dangerous. It could destroy trust, use fear to erode everything positive, even drive people mad. But when a group of wizards gathered, the rules changed. Everyone looked for faults, trying to outwit the creature. Let's see how many tricks this boggart had. Soon 2 identical Hermiones were pushed forward. They looked exactly alike, down to the silver-white staffs on their backs. Aha! Apparently everyone here has a slight fear of our Gryffindor lioness, so the pseudo-human boggart didn't hesitate to choose her. Lockhart beamed, his grin almost reaching his ears. Yeah, beating up a defense against the dark arts professor every year. Who wouldn't be in awe? Ron shot back, and Lockhart's smile froze. In the crowd, Draco's face tightened. His fear of Hermione wasn't just admiration for her power. He'd been on the receiving end of it, beaten and humiliated until he clammed up. No wonder the boggart had picked her. Are you two really that afraid of me? The two Hermiones asked in unison, tilting their heads. Ridiculous! Ridiculous! They cried, pointing at each other. But Lockhart had warned them. This mutated boggart didn't respond to the boggart-banishing charm in the usual way. Hermione's face flushed. The thing wearing her face felt like an insult. Dangerous blue light leapt from the tip of her staff, and a brilliant azure blade took form. The fake Hermione opposite also drew her staff, but she didn't have Philosopher's Stone magic. A faint, ambiguous blue flicker tried to imitate the light blade, and then fizzled. That was enough to surprise Hermione. The boggart had copied a bit of the stone's power. Not much, but if Hermione had only used starlight magic, the imitation might have gone unnoticed. We all know that creatures imitated by boggarts will possess a degree of the original's abilities, Lockhart said, watching. A boggart copying a Dementor will show some ability to drain happiness. Of course, it won't be strong. Using stronger magic will expose the sham, as Miss Granger has shown. The boggart in the center, exposed, began to ripple like a broken mosaic. Instinct told it to change again and slip into the crowd, but its intelligence was low. It transformed into Lockhart himself. Everyone, don't move. Let me step back a bit so you can see how this boggart hunts, Lockhart called, and retreated. The students formed a circle, giving him space. Confident it had blended in, the fake Lockhart strode up to Neville and said in a cold, stern voice, Mr. Longbottom, you failed your defense this year. Starting school half a year late, always a step behind, Neville's insecurity about being slow and inadequate was a raw spot the boggart found. But everyone knew the Lockhart in front of them was an imitation. Neville stood awkwardly, unsure what to say. Finally, he tilted his head and tried, Ridiculous? The laughter that burst from the others was like acid to the boggart. Genuine, joyful laughter, especially the kind that came from a group, could destroy even a mutated boggart. Confused at the lack of fear, the creature fled to another target. It landed on Harry, shifting into Professor Lily's image and scolding him loudly. You slack at the potions table. When will you ever make me stop worrying like Hermione does? You've let your mother down. You haven't inherited even a bit of her talent. Harry's cheeks burned at the words. The real Lily would never speak like that, but the boggart probed people's weaknesses. It tried every jab to squeeze out delicious fear. Harry, hot with anger and imitation, made his chain glow. The iron ball, enhanced by magic, rose and swung as if to strike the boggart. Terrified, the creature fled again. This time it chose Draco. Fear hid deep in him like a scent boggarts loved. It strode toward Draco and shifted into Lucius Malfoy, but not the well-dressed father they all knew. This Lucius wore ragged prison clothes, soaked through, smeared with blood. He staggered forward. The classmates fell back, leaving space. Draco's face drained of color. Even knowing the father was an illusion, his worst nightmares were playing out. Exactly the scenes that had haunted him in the dark. Draco, Draco, save me. The water dungeon in Malfoy Manor is freezing, and two-phase monsters torment me day and night. Draco, I'm your father. How could you leave me here? The fake Lucius knelt, crawling on hands and knees, seeping water and some unknown viscous fluid, eyes bloodshot and pleading. No, you're fake. You won't scare me. Draco barked, drawing a breath and shouting at the boggart. The creature flickered, struck by the defiance. Its face twisted into a look of heartbreak, half crying, half smiling. All right, take care of your mother. You must. Revive the Malfoy name, it whimpered. As it spoke, it began to disintegrate, sinking as if into an abyss. The illusory Lucius looked at Draco with a last, loving glance and then dissolved. Draco couldn't help himself. He took a step forward, hands trembling. The boggart sensed the overwhelming fear and switched to Narcissa, this time in a tragic, deathly state. No! Draco screamed and lunged. Lockhart, who was just behind him, grabbed him, stepping between Draco and the boggart. The creature shifted again, becoming two ragged little girls, 11 or 12, standing side by side and staring at Lockhart with icy eyes. Lockhart, true to form, let out a loud animated laugh. The thing in front of them wavered. One of the little girls thinned into a wisp and dissipated into the air. "See? Never let your guard down," Lockhart barked, one hand still on Draco, whose eyes were rimmed red as if he might cry. Even a boggart without much offensive power can make you feel like your heart is being ripped out. He looked over the students. The joking, snickering crowd had gone quiet. Even those who disliked Draco couldn't pretend indifference when someone they knew could be brought to his knees like that. "I think today's little demonstration will do more good than another dozen tedious lectures. Once you leave the school gates, you're likely to face dangers from unexpected places, alone. Staying alert is the most important rule for surviving out there." He handed Draco a fragment of chocolate and patted his shoulder. "Have some, it'll steady you." As the mood shifted from playful to serious, Lockhart led them through the ruined village, pointing things out as they went: how to tell whether dangerous creatures were nearby, how to move through unfamiliar ground, and how to deal with suspicious, enclosed spaces. "Fake boggarts cannot be dispelled by ridiculous," he warned, "but laughter can still send them away. Always keep something funny at the ready. If you can't think of anything, a small sip of euphoria elixir will help. It won't banish fake boggarts, but it can have a repelling effect." He turned to the group. "There are several boggarts hidden in this village. Your task is to use what I've taught you and find them. I suggest you pair off in 2s or 3s and spread out. It's easier to draw a boggart out that way. Come to me first to get a small ration of euphoria elixir and some chocolate. You must be able to hold on to your classmates and feed them the potion in a crisis." "Professor, how do we deal with a boggart once we find it?" Ron asked. Lockhart smiled. "My plan was to train your courage against boggarts, but if you can actually banish them with laughter, all the better. These things have hurt people before. If you still have the energy afterward, try to trap one in a box and bring it back. It might make useful teaching material." He was clearly flattering Hermione. She had never looked frightened. "Spread out. The village has been cleared, so there are no other dangers. I'll wait here. Before lunch, I'll fire a signal and blow a whistle. Whether you've found a boggart or not, return then. I fancy you wouldn't like to miss a meal." So they split into pairs and trios and fanned out. Harry and Ron paired up. Neville stuck close to Hermione because he was anxious to handle things on his own and felt safer with her. Draco ended up alone. Despite Lockhart's instruction to buddy up, the other Slytherins were reluctant. They would joke openly near him, but as soon as a wall hid them from the professor's eyes, their faces changed and they shoved him away, whispering, "We do not want to help him change his robes later." Daphne hesitated, almost teaming up with him, but Draco's pride flared and he refused her pity. He plunged solo into the gloomy ruins. Perhaps the boggarts here had been hungry. As the students scattered, the illusions sprang up quickly. Some encountered a scowling Professor McGonagall at a corner. Others saw a rotting version of a dead aunt crawling from a grave. The students who had sneered at Draco for being oversensitive found themselves equally, and sometimes worse, deceived. These fake boggarts weren't dumb. They used the victim's own inner life to build convincing scenes. The false McGonagall might warn of a great danger at school and urge them to follow to safety, drawing them into a more secluded spot for a shock. In truth, the images were all born of the students' own imaginations, perceived by the boggart and shaped into an enactment. Screams punctuated the village, rising and falling, but Lockhart's rule of 2 or 3 people per group paid off. When one student was frozen by fear, companions could steady and help them. Standing in the center of the ruins, Lockhart listened to the shrieks and smiled, more pleased by the minute. Boggarts did not confine themselves to impersonating people. Ron met an enormous, ugly, hairy spider and screamed, only for Harry, unflappable, to rush forward with a shout. The boggart immediately fled at Harry's boldness. Hermione and Neville, perhaps because Hermione carried so little fear or her magic was too strong, drew no boggart at all. That dashed Hermione's hopes of catching one. Draco, alone and raw, was in an especially fragile state when he met an unexpected visitor before a boggart could find him, Dobby. He walked between crumbling low walls, chocolate in hand already beginning to sweat. Every tiny sound made him flick his wand in nervous little motions. He regretted going it alone, but the memory of his classmates' expressions and Daphne's pity burned him. Better to face a boggart and his humiliation than to accept their condescension. Humiliation and anger swallowed his fear. A hot, hard resolve kindled in his chest. The horrid images of a false Lucius, his dead mother, and his classmates' scorn tightened in his chest until he thought, if I were as strong as Lockhart or Hermione, would they treat me like this? No, if I were that powerful, I wouldn't need them. They'd be the ones groveling to me. A sharp crack split the air, and something hunched into being before him, wrapped in filthy rags and covered in healed scars. Draco's breath hitched. He knew that figure instantly. Dobby! 116. Draco's secret conversation. No, you're fake. It's a boggart's trick again. Draco held his breath, telling himself not to be fooled this time. He tried to summon pleasant memories, to defeat it with laughter, but found he couldn't dredge up a single genuinely happy recollection. No first time on a toy broom, no pranks on Muggle servants, no carefree adventures in the outer city with childhood friends. Those memories only cut deeper now. His home was gone, his property confiscated, and his old playmates had become enemies who hated him. There seemed to be nothing left in the world that could make him truly laugh. He let out 2 dry, embarrassed laughs. It was useless. That sort of laughter wouldn't drive away a boggart. It looked like he would have to use the euphoria elixir the professor had given him. Little master, Dobby is not a boggart. Dobby is a house elf. Dobby lifted his head and blinked at Draco with his enormous, troubled eyes. He looked much better than when Narcissa had last seen him. The ointment from the medical wing had done wonders. How can you prove it? Draco demanded, wand in one hand, the vial in the other, watching the house elf warily. Still, a thought nagged him. If it were a boggart, would it have taken the form of Dobby to scare him? Wizards never cared for house elves much, and Draco had never felt anything beyond usefulness toward Dobby. Dobby! Dobby! Dobby scratched his head, flustered. He glanced around, snapped his fingers, and several pieces of rubble reassembled into an ornate suitcase. Something unknown was sealed inside and set before Draco. This is the boggart, little master, if you were looking for it. Draco approached the trembling suitcase with suspicion. It was still shaking, as if whatever was inside wanted to break free. He remembered Lockhart's advice. The closer you get to a boggart, the more a chill runs down your spine and your hair stands on end. This was no trick. There was a boggart inside. He lunged at Dobby, seizing the elf's dirty rag, his face suddenly hard. Why are you here? How is father? Dobby flinched. Master told Dobby to protect you and the mistress. Master is in the water prison. And what else? Draco demanded, then lowered his voice as realization hit him. He told you to kill Granger, didn't he? Yes, but Dobby couldn't do it. Dobby doesn't want to kill people. Dobby is not a good. Dobby began, voice breaking, but Draco cut him off. What about getting him out? Did he say how to get him out? Dobby shook his head, bewildered. Draco let go and slid down to sit against the wall, head bowed, lost in thought. After a long moment, he said bitterly, Forget it. He's not worth saving. Dobby watched the young master cautiously, afraid to speak. Also, don't kill Hermione. You can't beat her. Not even the professor can beat her. Dobby nodded vehemently. The mistress said the same, so Dobby won't go kill her. Draco looked up in surprise. You've seen Mother? When? Just a week ago. Dobby took advantage of the Hogwarts barrier failing and snuck in to see the mistress. Draco understood. The moment when Lockhart and Hermione had dueled and the school's anti-apparition charm had faltered. Anger flared again. Mother never tells me anything. She always keeps everything to herself, treating me like a child. Dobby eyed his irritable young master and spoke carefully. The mistress didn't want Dobby to stay at Hogwarts, so Dobby followed the castle when it moved. Today, Dobby sensed the little master's aura, so Dobby came to protect the little master. I don't need your protection, Draco roared. Who can you protect? You, a Dobby? The house elf fell silent under the outburst. Seeing the scars on Dobby's skin, Draco's voice softened. The elf had suffered to find them. I'm sorry, Dobby. If his father had been there, he'd have scolded Draco for giving in to small temper. As a Malfoy, he'd been raised to control his emotions. Dobby straightened. The little master does not need to apologize. Dobby is a Malfoy house elf. Dobby should serve his masters. Draco stared for a moment, then, half on impulse, asked, "You survived out there. You must be strong. Can you teach me magic?" Dobby sighed and bowed his head. What foolishness. Dobby's magic is not like wizard magic. Dobby learned that long ago. He rubbed his cushion of a pillowcase helplessly. Dobby cannot help the little master. Dobby is a bad Dobby. Seeing him on the verge of despair, Draco cut him off. All right, stop. He thought for a moment. Since Mother didn't give you a task, you should keep following the castle. From now on, I'll come out sometimes. I'll find a moment to be alone. Then you can come see me. As you command, little master. Dobby bowed. Something unreadable flashed in Draco's eyes. Hatred or humiliation. It was hard to tell. He continued, voice harder. To restore the Malfoy name, I must become stronger. Dobby, help me find ways to be stronger. Dark arts, lost alchemical tools, anything. This is the most important task I'm giving you. Take it seriously. I will, little master. Dobby will help the little master find a way to become stronger. Draco glanced at the suitcase at his feet. You go now. I'm taking this boggart with me. Don't let anyone see you, especially Granger and the professor. When Draco returned with the suitcase, the room went silent. The boy who had been reduced to tears an hour ago had, alone, captured the imposter boggart that even Hermione hadn't managed to seize. Several Slytherins scowled. Humiliation at being outshone mixed with the annoyance of having to listen to Draco swagger. Professor Lockhart, surprised, nonetheless made a show of praising Draco and awarded Slytherin 10 points, the first time he had ever given points to his own house. What's there to be proud of? If it weren't for boggarts avoiding Hermione, catching one of these things would be easy, Ron grumbled, defending Hermione. But Hermione didn't feel jealous. She was genuinely pleased that Draco had managed to conquer something of his own inner darkness. 117. Field practice for all grades. When the second years returned to the castle unscathed, they immediately became the center of attention in the Great Hall. Students from other years swarmed around them, asking what they had seen, whether there had been any danger, and whether they had acted alone. The boggart that Draco had captured was suddenly a prized curiosity. It was kept in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, and Lockhart said he would use it at an appropriate time to help the first years learn to be brave. The perfect success of the second year's outdoor practical allowed Professor McGonagall to relax. Letting a young professor take so many children outside, even with other professors patrolling nearby, had once made her uneasy, but she found her nerves had grown steadier in recent years. On the second and third days, the practicals continued. The third years were sent to the Biting Meadow, and the fourth years to the aberrant Swallowtail Wolfpack. The Biting Meadow was a sweeping expanse of beautiful green grass that, for some unfathomable reason, ate living things that passed through it, something like those terrifying biting cabbages of other folklores. Its deceptively lovely appearance had lured Muggles in the past, deeper and deeper into the wasteland. The aberrant swallowtail wolves were even harsher. They were descendants of the swallowtail dog, a breed long favored by wizards for its loyalty to them and its ferocity toward Muggles. Swallowtail dogs would eat almost any scrap, so many wizards had kept them. After the Great War, with many of their owners dead, those dogs lost their discipline. Their hardiness let them survive in the wild, and over time they mutated into ravenous, pack-forming beasts that stripped every edible thing in their path, even chewing at the topsoil. Fortunately, their low reproductive rate kept their numbers from exploding, and aside from their adaptability, they were not supernaturally powerful, so they had not yet become a full-blown disaster. Lockhart, with the Weasley twins among his group, led the fourth years against an entire pack. For many of the students, it was their first time seeing blood. The fight was brutal and visceral. Flesh and blood flew, and several students vomited, but the work had to continue. Spells were cast until the creatures were finally driven off. The instructors stressed that allowing such feral, formerly domesticated beasts to roam unchecked would further ruin an already fragile ecosystem. If the fourth year's lesson had been a violent introduction, the fifth year's fieldwork showed a different cruelty. They were taken to a Muggle settlement where a cult had taken hold, led by a dark wizard of sorts, a savage who had awakened to magic but had never been trained. He called his power a miracle and demanded that the Muggles submit and offer live sacrifices, promising a tomorrow flowing with milk and honey in return. Lockhart and the students were met with curses and hostility when they arrived. They exposed the charlatan and killed him, but gratitude was not forthcoming, only hatred. The Muggles preferred to believe in the cult leader's terrible promises rather than trust the devils who wielded magic. The students quietly helped as best they could, repairing walls and defenses, distributing food and medicine. At one point, a girl almost died after eating food handed to her by a little girl whom the students had rescued from the sacrificial pit. It was a harsh lesson in the depths of ignorance produced by the wasteland and the yawning divide between wizards and Muggles. The sixth and seventh years had their experiences combined into a single, grimmer expedition. Lockhart led them into a former war zone, an area scorched by the Wizengamot, where fiendfire had burned through an entire Muggle underground cave. The earth was cracked and blackened, white smoke hissed from fissures. Even a year later, black flames still smoldered below ground, occasionally surging into towering pillars of fire, accompanied by sounds like the wails of tormented spirits. Under Lockhart's direction, the students worked in unison, using counter-curses and careful, steady advances until the fiendfire was finally extinguished. They performed their work under the cold observation of members of the Wizengamot, who had established a stronghold nearby and watched indifferently. The sight made the students feel a deep divide. These were wizards, and yet the gap between the two groups felt immense, like two ways of being that could no longer be reconciled. It was hard for them to imagine that at other schools, children their age were being taught how to conjure fiendfire and how to dispose of bodies. Afterwards, Lockhart told them bluntly that this tedious, dangerous, and often thankless work was what members of the Order of the Phoenix did every day. They tried to mend a broken world, even when results were minimal and hope seemed thin. His words moved many of the older students. Several resolved to join the Order once they graduated and to offer their strength to that cause. Dumbledore had invited Lockhart to join the Order more than once. Lockhart's actions often resembled those of Order members, but Lockhart always declined. He admired the Order's ideals, but for reasons of his own, preferred to help as an outsider. In the end, Dumbledore had to give up on convincing him. While the older students contemplated the wider world, the younger ones could still enjoy a measure of normal campus life. Draco found himself treated differently after he captured the boggart. Professors looked at him in a new light, and many of the students who had once bullied him no longer dared prank him. He would never admit it, but seeing his mother smile again made him exceptionally happy. He also discovered how much honor could help someone claw out of the depths. Praise opened doors that had been closed to him. He raised his hand more often in class and threw himself into his homework. Aside from Hermione, who was consistently first, Draco began competing with Harry. Between them, they alternated in second and third place, and he racked up many points for Slytherin. Those who still disliked him stopped attacking openly. At worst, they muttered behind his back, sourly. No matter how hard he tries, he's still a murderer's child. What truly turned Draco and Harry into rivals was Quidditch. Draco trained obsessively to win honor for himself, and in the first match against Gryffindor, he flew like a cold, silent arrow across the pitch, coming within reach of the golden snitch more than once. He might have had slightly less raw talent than Harry, but his relentless practice forced Harry to mark him closely and expend energy on Draco instead of on searching for the snitch. On Quidditch days, Professor McGonagall opened Hogwarts' Flu Network so guests from other places could come and watch. The student body alone couldn't supply the kind of crowd a real match deserved, and the revived games were also a way to show that the wizarding world was recovering. These agile young flyers represented the future. Noble families from various communities often came, and they were happy to donate supplies to the school. Even with reparations from Malfoy Manor, Hogwarts could use the funds, and more donations would help loosen the school's financial dependence on Malfoy holdings. Hermione noticed another, quieter benefit. She and Score, the little spirit bound to her by contract, had started to influence Quidditch matches. Score would sometimes slip into the golden snitch during a game and nudge its course. With centuries of Quidditch experience, Score handled the snitch almost like a phantom, driving seekers from all four houses to frustration. Once, in a Hufflepuff versus Ravenclaw match, neither team could catch the snitch. Both sides chased it all day, eating and drinking on their brooms, until Score finally grew bored and ended the farce. As the season went on, Score grew noticeably smarter. Through his contract with Hermione, he began channeling more Shining Stone magic from his main body. His output limits rose, and he might soon be able to cast more complex spells independently. That would give Hermione more tactical options. Until now, Score could only ram opponents or use Hermione's magic to form a barrier, but if he learned to cast other spells himself, the possibilities would expand. To develop like that, however, he needed a lot of matches, and Hogwarts alone might not provide enough. A worldwide Quidditch Cup would be ideal. One odd little detail. Barty Crouch Jr., head of law enforcement at Malfoy Manor, had taken to attending the matches obsessively. He was always among the first to arrive and the last to leave, and he repeatedly asked McGonagall whether Dumbledore would be coming. He was often seen lingering near the stone statues on the 8th floor. McGonagall guessed he was trying to learn about the Philosopher's Stone. These noble visitors had been rebuffed before, but they did not give up easily. Dumbledore himself, however, was elusive. Hermione rarely knew where he was. She had returned all contracts and ashes to him personally, and now the only thing left linked to Dumbledore at Hogwarts was the castle's core Philosopher's Stone. Still, that was not her immediate concern. After finishing the twins' textbooks, Hermione set to work on the Shining Stone magic thesis she had promised Professor Flitwick. 2 theses were planned for the year. She wanted to complete at least one before Christmas, so the rest of the year wouldn't be too pressured. Harry, for his part, kept bringing up the Marauders' Amicus notes and tried to prod Hermione into prioritizing human transfiguration. Spurred on by Draco's competitiveness, Harry wanted to master human transfiguration quickly so he could dominate transfiguration lessons as well as Quidditch and potions. Hermione refused. She wasn't a child eager only to win. McGonagall had warned her sternly about human transfiguration. Its danger lay in its near irreversibility. Even if Hermione herself might be brave enough to try, she felt a responsibility not to teach Harry or others prematurely. Compared with other spells, the hardest part of transfiguration is maintaining the will during the casting, what you want the target to become, to what extent, and for how long. When the target is an external object, the magic is only an extension of the caster's will and will fade with the caster's power. But self-transfiguration is different. The caster's magic acts on his own body in a continuous loop. The wizard keeps producing magic, which makes the transformation hard to stop. Every detail, the desired form, the degree, the duration, requires absolute clarity and control. A small mistake can produce permanent changes outsiders would find hard to reverse. Self-transfiguration is, in effect, a wizard modifying his own mind and body. His brain is defenseless against his own magic, as if he had cast Imperius on himself. He could come to believe he is an animal and lose his wizarding self. Even the greatest transfiguration masters would struggle to undo that. Young wizards are inherently unstable. It's difficult enough to get them to sit still in class, let alone control their thoughts perfectly. In ancient Eastern practices, this kind of self-discipline was taught as a special cultivation to subdue the mind ape, and Hermione thought the comparison fit Harry. He was a jumping monkey, always ready for an adventure. James had been the same, reckless and adventurous, but James also had exceptional transfiguration talent, and Hermione suspected Harry might inherit something of that aptitude. In potions, though, Harry had been a slow starter. Without Lily's frequent tutoring, he probably wouldn't have beaten Draco as often as he had. Powerful transfigurers almost always have superior control in other areas of magic, which is why transfiguration is considered the jewel of magical theory. Faced with Harry's persistence, Hermione tossed the twins' old textbooks at him and made a bargain. If he could self-study the third-year transfiguration material by Christmas, she would consider advancing the human transfiguration issue. In truth, Hermione judged her own transfiguration knowledge to be around a 4th to 5th year level, but her mature mind and strong will gave her better control than many adults. That didn't mean she would claim to be ready to perform biological transfiguration. Lately, Hermione had been borrowing books from Percy Weasley, the third Weasley brother, out of respect for the older students. Cedric was not particularly close to her, and Percy, despite his lack of humor, got along well enough with her. He liked to keep company with high achievers. Percy valued his textbooks highly, so he only let Hermione use them during common room hours each evening and insisted on being present while she studied. As a prefect and likely head boy next year, he was always busy running between floors to help coordinate affairs for professors and students, and the time Hermione could borrow his books was growing scarce. 119. Death Day party time flew. Another month had passed in a flash, and Halloween was almost upon them. The comfortable, pleasant rhythm of school life let Hermione relax for the first time in weeks. She had finally finished Percy's textbook, and her thesis on Cragshard was nearly complete, though she hadn't shown it to Professor Flitwick yet. The final revisions would take some time, but it would certainly be done after Halloween. With late October came a sudden chill. Even inside perpetually warm Hogwarts, a cold seemed to seep in from beyond the barrier. The castle had come to rest over southern France, a region the Wizengamot swept clean with frightening regularity. Dozens of towns and villages lay white with ash, and now and then silent wizards in black robes walked the countryside. They carried identical wands and drove fiendfire like shepherds driving a flock, letting those black flames chew the land to smoldering ruin. Lockhart said it was meant to sever the goblins' connection to the earth and prevent hidden goblin tunnels from forming. Hogwarts itself could not be found by those wizards, but Grindelwald seemed able to watch the surrounding countryside through them. As the castle prepared to leave France, he sent someone to the school again, a present for Dumbledore. It was the same magical potion as before, but this time, Peter Pettigrew was not the messenger. Lockhart's classes had smoothed out into something almost bearable. In recent theory and practical lessons, he charmed the students with a bluff combination of showmanship and surprisingly apt tactical advice. He was quickly becoming a favorite. Even some Slytherins, grumbling at his remarks, had to admit the young, handsome, clever, and witty professor was hard to fault. Of course, they all thought he would be more fitting as a proper Malfoy Manor noble. Harry, Ron, and Neville were invited by the ghosts to attend the Death Day party in the Great Hall on Halloween. The ghosts had deliberately chosen a time when Hermione wasn't to be around. They were quite afraid of her and didn't want her there. When Harry awkwardly told Hermione, she firmly advised them not to go. A party for the dead was bad for the living, she said, recalling images of the sky pummeled by death ritual spears in the Forbidden Land. Of those who traveled at night, the Night Riders were terrifying, and worse still were the Birds of Death, skeletal, bird-headed monsters with the very power to stop children in their tracks. Hermione's head ached just thinking of them. The boys thought she was being ridiculously overcautious, or perhaps jealous that she hadn't been invited. "Merlin, it's Hogwarts' first Death Day party in decades," Ron protested. "And it's Sir Nicholas's 500th Death Day. He's going to announce the return of the Hogwarts ghosts to the whole school. They say Dumbledore will be there, and they're even inviting the Headless Hunt. They're going to rise over Hogwarts on Halloween night." None of them had been to a ghost party before. They'd only seen ghosts a handful of times. It sounded like an adventure straight out of one of Lockhart's books, Dancing with Ghosts and the like. Hermione didn't try to stop them beyond telling them not to go. Let them get themselves into trouble. At worst, it would mean 2 bottles of potion in the hospital wing. With Dumbledore there, the ghosts' largest leader, she reckoned they probably wouldn't end up flipping the ceiling and falling into the Great Hall. On Halloween, only Hermione sat at the long Gryffindor table, eating alone. She noticed keenly that many other students had invitations. The ghosts, bound within the school for decades, craved company and had invited students and professors they knew from their own houses. As Hermione had expected, only naive first years and a few overly confident older students actually accepted. Among the adults, the only living teacher who attended was Lockhart, and even he did it knowing full well what ghosts were like. Myrtle had apparently taken to pestering him instantaneously, never letting him go to the lavatory in peace. Lockhart, hopeless with attention from the opposite sex, had agreed in a fluster. When Harry and his friends returned to the common room that night, their lips were blue with cold. The warming charms on their uniforms had not kept out the chill of the ghosts, and worse than the cold was the gnawing hunger. Those rotten intestines with green mold, the fallen cheese, and the tombstone cake. It was awful, Harry complained. Professor Lockhart didn't warn us, Ron said. He wrapped himself up like a brown bear, cast half a dozen spells, and drank some stimulating potion beforehand. His ears smoked all night. Colin and Ginny had fared better. They'd managed to get 2 chocolate frogs from Lockhart. He didn't expect so many first years, otherwise he'd have brought more supplies, Colin said. But he wasn't great either. He kept mistaking Ginny for someone else and muttering to the air. Don't even mention him, Harry said. Even Dumbledore didn't expect so many children to come. It's the first time I've seen the headmaster surprised. He rubbed his legs hard, trying to warm them. Hermione, prepared as ever, produced pies and roasted rats she had saved from the feast. I hope this teaches you not to accept every invitation, she said. Merlin, this saved our lives, Ron said, stuffing pie into his mouth. But your tone is exactly like Lockhart's. Lockhart was going to send us back early, even if it would have been rude, Harry continued. But Dumbledore insisted that even young wizards are responsible for their choices, so he made us at least stay for the Headless Hunt's performance. You can't imagine how bad the second half was, Harry said, as if reliving a nightmare. The fat friar led ghost owls into the hall. They started raining droppings everywhere. When the Headless Knights arrived, they startled the owls and the birds screamed and flapped and made things even worse. They're almost like cats, terrifying when stressed. The whole party turned into chaos. Everyone was screaming and running. Except Dumbledore, Neville muttered, gnawing on a rat leg. He didn't seem to feel the cold at all. He got along with the ghosts just fine. Ginny, smoothing herself with the fresh start charm she'd just learned, nodded. Hermione shrugged. He is, after all, the most powerful white wizard. Probably best not to tell the other students quite how well their headmaster gets on with the ghosts. 120. Bone Extraction Curse. As Hermione had predicted, the day after Halloween, every child who had gone to the ghosts' party fell ill. Madame Pomfrey grumbled to Dumbledore, but as Hermione had already said, catching a cold wasn't a major problem in the wizarding world. 1 potion each, and they were all better within a couple of hours. What was outrageous was that Hermione, the only student who hadn't gone to the Death Day party and so hadn't needed a potion, ended up in the hospital wing herself with a nasty cold after everyone else had recovered. It's magic flu, Narcissa said in a muffled voice, handing her a potion while wearing a simple face covering. When a lot of children get sick at once, a strange magical germ forms. It spreads to other healthy children. How can there be such a thing? They only caught colds. There aren't even germs. Hermione protested, grimacing at the potion's bitterness as she swallowed. That's magic, Narcissa shrugged. It's usually thought to be a sort of psychological meme germ. Children unconsciously want company in suffering. They wish others to go through it with them. Blame Dumbledore, Madame Pomfrey exploded. He probably thinks the hospital wing isn't busy enough and wants to give my old bones more work. She fussed at the bed and patted the pillow as if it were Dumbledore's head. Or maybe he hopes to use up some of Pomona's herbs. She shook her head. Either way, that old fellow's brain must be half eaten by ghosts. After taking the potion, Hermione felt much better, but Madame Pomfrey refused her requests to do homework or read. She wasn't allowed back to the dormitory either. She had to stay in the hospital wing for observation for half a day. It was the day of a new round of Quidditch, and Hermione couldn't attend. All she could do was listen to the faint shouts and cheers drifting in from outside the windows and close her eyes, mentally rehearsing spells and movements. The cheering finally faded, and the room grew quiet, except for the small noises of Narcissa arranging linens. Then the hospital wing door burst open, and Gilderoy Lockhart strode in, supporting Draco Malfoy. "Oh, Merlin, what happened?" Narcissa hurried over. "Draco fell off his broom trying to catch the golden snitch and broke his arm," Lockhart said, his voice embarrassed, particularly with the boy's mother present. Madame Pomfrey stepped forward and rolled up Draco's sleeve. His arm hung limply, as if made of rubber. He didn't seem to feel anything. "How did it come to this? Did you let the student do it himself?" she demanded. Narcissa darted to the medicine cabinet, clattering through bottles. "It was my carelessness." Lockhart stammered, cheeks flushing. It was the first time he had made such a serious mistake. "I only meant to demonstrate battlefield first aid to the students, but—" He could not finish. "Gilderoy, you're a grown man and a wizard of some repute. How could you make such a basic error?" Madame Pomfrey said, incredulous. "I've read your descriptions of bone-setting spells. They're quite thorough. I recommended them to Narcissa." "Skelegro," Narcissa said, producing the remedy and holding the potion to Draco's lips as Lockhart's face burned red. He kept apologizing, but Narcissa's anger at her son's state didn't let her be lenient. Draco, though, was in remarkably good spirits. "I caught the snitch! Slytherin beat Ravenclaw," he announced as he drank the Skelegro. His eyes were still bright with the thrill of the match. He seemed hardly to notice the pain. "You don't have to try so hard, Draco," Narcissa said more softly, her tone easing. "Everyone knows how good you are." "It's not enough," Draco said, narrowing his eyes. "I still have to beat Harry. He's my biggest rival." He knew he lagged behind Harry in Quidditch. Harry could spot the snitch first, and he flew with a natural ease Draco hadn't managed to match. And Slytherin's score in the House Cup was always being squeezed by Gryffindor. With Hermione excelling in academics, Harry excelling in sports, and Ron and Neville pitching in, could Gryffindor really dominate Hogwarts for 6 years? The other houses wouldn't accept that forever. Narcissa accepted Lockhart's apology at last, though the stiffness in her voice remained. "I hope this is the last time, Professor," she said. "You're talented and knowledgeable, but everyone makes mistakes. Next time, if something like this happens, hand the situation straight over to us." Lockhart bowed his head. "I've been under a lot of pressure lately. It was a simple spell, really. I originally meant to demonstrate emergency treatment for Draco, but halfway through the charm, I suddenly saw my 2 dead sisters standing in the crowd. I thought someone had released a boggart and He faltered, embarrassed. "I mispronounced the incantation." Hermione felt a chill. That was a dangerous error. In a life-or-death situation, it could be fatal. "Don't be so hard on yourself, Gilderoy," Madame Pomfrey soothed. "The students adore you. You hear them praising you in the corridors all the time. I've even heard girls call your name in the infirmary at night. You don't need to push yourself so hard." "Oh, that sounds even worse," Lockhart muttered. He sighed. "I just don't want to let Dumbledore down. I want to do better. And being back at school, every time I step into the crowd, I remember my sisters. They wanted to attend Hogwarts so much, and they never got the chance." Hermione remembered Harry and the others mentioning that Lockhart had seemed distracted lately and that he spoke often of his sisters. It sounded as if their memory had become an inner torment, something that a boggart could find and something that interfered with him in the middle of spells. Maybe returning to teaching here wasn't the best choice, she thought. The setting seemed likely to trigger his frailties. Madame Pomfrey, ever practical, prescribed something for the professor too. "Take 2 sleeping draughts before you leave. That should help," she said, taming his nerves with medicine. Hermione felt sympathy for him, but knew too well that a potion could only treat the symptoms, not the cause. If Lockhart's memories and guilt were the real problem, he would have to face them himself before anything like this could stop happening.